The scream came from the east corridor of the palace, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet of the early morning like a blade through silk. Elena's heart froze where she stood, a basket of linens pressed against her hip, her heart slamming against her ribs. She knew that scream. It belonged to Grace, the young kitchen girl who had become the closest thing Elena had to a friend, inside the cold stone walls of the Cross Palace. She dropped the basket and ran. The halls of the palace were built for kings, not for servants, and Elena's worn shoes slapped against marble that gleamed under morning light pouring through tall windows. She turned a corner and nearly collided with a guard, who caught her by the shoulder before she could fall. "Where is she?" Elena gasped. "Where is Grace?" The guard, a broad man named Ronan, with kind eyes and a scar along his jaw, pointed down the corridor. "The training yard. Hurry." Elena did not wait for more explanation. She pushed past him and sprinted toward the sound of raised voices, her breath burning in her chest. When she reached the yard, what she saw made her stop cold. Grace was on the ground, curled protectively around herself, while 3 young nobles stood over her, laughing. One of them, a tall young man with slicked hair and a cruel smile, held a training whip loosely in his hand, though it was clear from Grace's trembling shoulders that he had already used it. "She spilled wine on my boots," the young man said, as if that explained everything. "Servants need to learn their place." Elena's blood turned to ice, then to fire. She did not think. She simply moved, placing herself between Grace and the young noble, her chin lifted despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "She is a person," Elena said, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "Not a rug for you to punish." The young noble's smile faded into something colder. "And who are you to speak to me this way? A maid does not address a lord. Then perhaps a lord should not act like he has forgotten what mercy means," Elena replied. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Servants did not speak this way to nobles. It simply was not done. But Elena had spent her whole life watching cruelty pass by unchallenged, and something in her, something old and unbending, refused to let it happen again. The young noble raised the whip, his patience gone. "You will regret that, Maid." Before the whip could fall, a voice cut through the yard, low and commanding, carrying an authority that made every single person present go still. "Put it down." Elena turned, along with everyone else, to see King Damien Cross standing at the edge of the yard, his dark eyes fixed on the young noble, with an intensity that seemed to steal the warmth from the air itself. He wore simple black training clothes, as though he had been walking the grounds rather than holding court, but there was nothing simple about the power radiating from him. He was the Alpha King, the strongest wolf in the northern pack, and even those who had never met him could feel the weight of his presence the moment he entered a room. The young noble's face drained of color. "Your Majesty, I heard what you were only doing," Damien said, his voice quiet, which somehow made it more frightening than if he had shouted. "Drop the whip." The whip clattered to the stone ground. Damien's gaze moved briefly to Grace, still curled on the ground, and something flickered across his expression, something that might have been genuine concern, though it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Then his eyes found Elena. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elena had seen the king from a distance many times in her 3 years working at the palace, always across a hall, always surrounded by guards and advisors, always unreachable. She had never stood this close to him. She had never felt the full force of his attention directed at her alone. His eyes were dark, almost black, but there was something else in them too, something searching, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle he had not expected to encounter that morning. "You spoke to a noble as an equal," Damien said finally, addressing Elena, though his words seemed meant for the entire yard to hear. "Do you understand the risk you took?" Elena lifted her chin, refusing to look away, even though every instinct told her to bow her head and apologize. "I understand that someone was being hurt, and I could not stand by and do nothing." A murmur rippled through the gathered servants and nobles alike. No one spoke to the king this way either, and yet here she was, doing exactly that. Damien studied her for a long moment. Then, without another word to the trembling noble, he turned and knelt beside Grace, checking her injuries with surprising gentleness, for a man known throughout the kingdom for his ruthlessness in matters of pack law and war. He helped her to her feet himself, an act that made the assembled crowd exchange stunned glances, and instructed Ronan to see her to the healer. Only then did he turn back to the young noble. "You will leave my palace by nightfall. Return to your father's territory, and tell him what happened here today. Tell him his son forgot what it means to hold power without honor." The young noble stammered an apology that no one accepted, and hurried away with his companions trailing behind him, their earlier laughter replaced by pale, frightened silence. The yard slowly emptied as servants returned to their duties, whispering among themselves about what they had witnessed. Elena remained where she stood, uncertain whether she was about to be punished for her boldness or simply forgotten, now that the crisis had passed. She was not forgotten. Damien approached her, his footsteps unhurried, his gaze never leaving her face. Up close, she could see details she had never noticed from a distance, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, as though sleep did not come easily to him, and the quiet intensity that seemed to live permanently in his expression, as if he were always thinking 3 moves ahead of everyone around him. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elena, Your Majesty. Elena Hart." "How long have you worked in this palace, Elena Hart?" 3 years, Your Majesty." "And in 3 years, no one has ever seen you defend another servant the way you defended Grace today." It was not quite a question, so Elena was unsure how to answer. "I have never seen anyone hurt so badly before, Your Majesty. I could not simply watch." Something shifted in Damien's expression, subtle but unmistakable, like a door, opening a crack to reveal a room that had been locked for a long time. "Most people watch," he said quietly. "Most people find it easier to look away." "Then most people are wrong," Elena said, before she could stop herself. For a heartbeat, she feared she had gone too far again, but instead of anger, something close to a smile touched the corner of Damien's mouth, there and gone so quickly she almost believed she had imagined it. "Return to your duties, Elena Hart," he said. "And know that what you did today will not be forgotten." He turned and walked away, his advisors falling into step behind him, as if they had been waiting at the edges of the yard the entire time, careful never to interrupt whatever had just occurred. Elena stood alone for a long moment, her heart still racing, though now for reasons she could not fully name. She did not know, in that moment, that the king had been watching her for far longer than that single morning. She did not know that word of small kindnesses she had shown, quiet moments of decency in a palace that often rewarded cruelty and ambition instead, had already reached his ears through servants who trusted him more than they trusted the nobles who looked down on them. She did not know that something had already begun to take root in him, something he did not yet have a name for, though it had started the very first time he saw her kneeling beside an injured stable boy months ago, tending his wounds with more care than any healer in the palace. Elena knew none of this. She only knew that her hands were still trembling, and that somewhere behind her, whispers were already spreading through the palace like wildfire. By midday, everyone in the palace had heard the story, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. Some claimed Elena had struck the noble herself. Others said the king had threatened to banish the boy's entire family. The truth, as it often does, became harder to find beneath the layers of gossip, but one detail remained consistent in every version. The king had looked at the maid the way he had never looked at anyone before. Elena tried to ignore the whispers as she returned to her work, folding linens and preparing rooms for a ball that was to take place within the week, an event the entire kingdom had been anticipating for months. The Alpha King's ball was meant to be the occasion on which Damien Cross would finally choose his Luna, his mate and queen, from among the daughters of the Northern Pact's most powerful families. Nobles from every corner of the territory had already begun arriving, their carriages filling the palace courtyard, their servants filling the palace halls with unfamiliar faces and foreign accents. Among them was Lady Serafina Vale, daughter of one of the wealthiest and most influential families in the kingdom, whose beauty was matched only by her ambition. She had made no secret of her intention to become the next Luna, and most of the court considered her the obvious choice, given her lineage and the political alliance her family could offer the throne. Elena had seen Serafina only once, gliding through the palace halls in a gown the color of spilled wine, trailed by a small army of attendants who rushed to smooth every wrinkle in her dress before it could form. Serafina had not so much as glanced at Elena, treating her the way she treated all servants, as though she were furniture rather than a person. That evening, as Elena helped prepare the guest chambers for the arriving nobles, Grace found her in the hallway, her face still bruised but her eyes bright with something like awe. "You spoke to the king," Grace whispered, as though saying it aloud might undo the memory. "You actually spoke to him, and he did not punish you." "I was frightened the entire time," Elena admitted, setting down a stack of fresh sheets. "I thought he might have me thrown out of the palace." "He looked at you like you were the only person in the entire yard," Grace said. "I saw it. Everyone saw it." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, and busied herself with folding a blanket that did not need folding. He was simply doing his duty as Alpha King. Protecting servants from cruelty is his responsibility. "Is that truly what you believe happened?" Grace asked, a small smile tugging at her lips, despite the bruise darkening along her cheekbone. Elena did not answer, because she was not entirely sure what she believed. She only knew that something had shifted that morning, some quiet current beneath the surface of her ordinary life, and she could not yet tell whether it would carry her toward something wonderful or something dangerous. She thought of the king's eyes, dark and searching, and the way he had knelt beside Grace with such unexpected gentleness. She thought of his voice, quiet but absolute, the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed without needing to raise it. And she thought, though she tried not to, of the strange warmth that had spread through her chest when he told her that what she did would not be forgotten. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings did not fall for maids. Alphas did not choose servants over noble daughters bred for exactly this purpose. The kingdom had rules, unwritten but unbreakable, and Elena had lived within those rules her entire life, careful never to want more than what was given to her, careful never to hope for things that were never meant to belong to someone like her. But that night, as she lay on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, staring up at the cracked ceiling above her, she found herself thinking of dark eyes, and a voice that had called her name, as though it mattered, and for the first time in a very long while, Elena allowed herself to wonder what it might feel like to be seen, truly seen, by someone the entire kingdom looked up to. She did not know that across the palace, in a chamber far grander than her own, Damien Cross was lying awake as well, staring at his own ceiling, replaying the moment a maid with fire in her voice had looked him directly in the eye and refused to back down. He did not know why the memory would not leave him, why it settled into his chest and refused to loosen its grip. He only knew that in a matter of days, he would be expected to choose a Luna from a long list of noble daughters who had spent their entire lives preparing for that exact moment. And for the first time in his life, Damien Cross was not certain the choice everyone expected of him was the choice he wanted to make. The palace slept, unaware that the quiet beginnings of something extraordinary had already been set into motion, a story that would soon unfold before the entire kingdom, one that no one, least of all Elena Hart, could have predicted. 3 days before the Alpha King's ball, the palace transformed into something Elena barely recognized. Every hallway filled with the scent of fresh flowers, imported from territories far beyond the northern Pax borders. Servants rushed from room to room, carrying bolts of silk, polishing silver until it gleamed like captured moonlight, and rehearsing the precise choreography of an event that would decide the future of the entire kingdom. Elena had never seen the palace so alive, nor so tense. She had been assigned to serve in the grand ballroom itself, a duty that filled her with a strange mixture of dread and curiosity. She would witness the moment Damien Cross chose his Luna, standing at the edges of the room where servants belonged, invisible to the nobles who would fill the space with silk gowns and desperate hope. Grace, now fully recovered from her injuries, worked beside her, arranging chairs along the ballroom's outer walls. "They say Lady Seraphina Vale has already ordered a crown to be made," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one important was listening, as though the choice has already been decided. "Perhaps it has," Elena said, though the words left a strange hollow feeling in her chest that she chose not to examine too closely. Her family holds more influence than any other in the kingdom. It would make sense for the king to choose her. "Sense is not the same as desire," Grace said, giving her a knowing look that made Elena's cheeks warm despite herself. "I still remember how he looked at you in the training yard. That was days ago, Grace. And it meant nothing. Kings do not look twice at maids. This one already has." Elena did not answer, choosing instead to focus on the delicate work of arranging candles along the long banquet table that would soon hold enough food to feed an entire village. She told herself that whatever strange flutter she felt whenever she thought of dark, searching eyes was simply nerves about the size and importance of the event ahead. She told herself this many times over the following days, and each time, she believed it a little less. On the morning of the ball, Elena woke before dawn to help prepare the grand hall for the evening's festivities. The palace buzzed with barely contained energy, servants moving with practiced efficiency despite the exhaustion evident on every face. She spent hours polishing brass fixtures, arranging fresh flowers along the staircases, and helping the head housekeeper, a stern but fair woman named Mrs. Whitfield, ensure that every detail met the impossible standards expected of a royal celebration. By late afternoon, the first carriages began arriving, filling the courtyard with the sound of hooves and excited chatter. Noble families from across the northern Pax territories poured into the palace, their daughters dressed in gowns that cost more than Elena would earn in a lifetime of service. She watched from the shadows of the grand hall as young women practiced their curtsies, whispered strategies to each other, and cast sharp, evaluating glances at their rivals. Lady Seraphina Vale arrived last, as though timing her entrance for maximum effect. Her gown was the deep crimson of fresh roses, embroidered with gold thread that caught the candlelight with every movement. Attendants trailed behind her, adjusting the train of her dress, fussing over strands of her dark hair that had already been arranged to perfection. She moved through the hall like a queen already crowned, accepting compliments and bows with practiced grace. "She looks like she was born for this moment," Grace murmured beside Elena, both of them watching from their positions near the wall. "Perhaps she was," Elena replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. As the evening progressed, the grand ballroom filled with music, laughter, and the particular kind of tension that comes from dozens of people all wanting the same impossible thing. Elena moved carefully through the crowd, refilling goblets and carrying trays of delicate pastries, careful to remain unseen, careful to remember her place among the glittering silks and confident smiles surrounding her. She caught glimpses of King Damien throughout the evening, always at the center of attention, always surrounded by advisors and hopeful noble families, eager for even a moment of his time. He wore formal black attire that made him look even more imposing than usual, his dark hair swept back, his expression carefully composed into the polite, distant mask expected of an alpha king at such an important event. He danced with several young women over the course of the evening, each dance performed with flawless technique but little warmth, as though he were completing a duty rather than enjoying a celebration. Elena told herself she was not watching him more closely than any other guest in the room. She told herself this was simply her job, to be aware of everyone's needs, to anticipate empty goblets and dropped napkins. She told herself many things that evening, and none of them were entirely true. It was well past midnight when the ball had reached its peak and most guests had grown flushed with wine and dancing, that Elena found herself near the edge of the ballroom floor, balancing a tray of empty glasses, when she felt a strange prickling sensation along the back of her neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. She turned and found Damien Cross looking directly at her from across the room. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade. The music continued, the laughter continued, the swirl of silk and jewels continued around them, but Elena felt as though she and the king existed in a separate, silent space, connected by nothing more than the weight of his gaze. He did not look away, even as one of his advisors leaned close to whisper something in his ear. He did not look away, even as Lady Seraphina approached him, her fan fluttering, her smile brilliant and practiced. Elena forced herself to look away first, her heart pounding, her hands suddenly unsteady around the tray she carried. She retreated toward the kitchen doors, telling herself she had imagined the intensity of that gaze, that surely a king surrounded by the most eligible women in the kingdom had no reason to notice a maid standing quietly at the edges of his celebration. But when she glanced back, just once, she found his eyes still fixed on her, even as Seraphina spoke animatedly beside him, clearly unaware that his attention had drifted elsewhere entirely. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Elena. She continued her duties, refilling drinks, clearing empty plates, helping other servants manage the endless demands of the celebration, but she could not shake the feeling that something significant was building beneath the surface of the night, something the entire room could sense but no one could yet name. Near the ballroom's grand staircase, she overheard two young noblewomen whispering behind their fans. "Did you notice how he watched the servants earlier this week?" one of them said, her voice low with scandal. The story has spread through every noble house in the territory. He defended a maid against Lord Whitmore's son, right there in the training yard, in front of everyone. Surely that means nothing, the other replied, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. An alpha king must maintain order among his household. It has nothing to do with affection. Perhaps, the first woman said, but I have never heard of a king kneeling to check on an injured kitchen maid with his own hands. My father says even the guards were shocked. Elena moved quickly past them before they could notice her listening, her face burning with an emotion she could not quite name. Was this what the entire kingdom now believed about her? That she had somehow become entangled in matters far beyond her station, simply because she had refused to stand silent while someone was hurt? She found a quiet corner near the kitchen entrance, and allowed herself a rare moment of stillness, closing her eyes, trying to steady the rapid beat of her heart. When she opened them again, she found herself face to face with Lady Seraphina Vale, who had apparently followed her from the ballroom floor. Up close, Seraphina's beauty was even more striking, her dark eyes sharp with an intelligence that Elena had not expected, her expression calm, despite the clear challenge simmering beneath the surface. "You are the maid from the training yard," Seraphina said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "The one who spoke to the king as though she were his equal." "I only spoke in defense of my friend, my lady," Elena said carefully, bowing her head in the proper gesture of respect. "I meant no disrespect toward His Majesty." "I am sure you did not," Seraphina replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But I have heard the way people speak of it now, as though a maid's small act of courage were something remarkable, something worthy of the king's personal attention." She stepped closer, her gaze narrowing slightly. "I would advise you to remember your place, Elena Hart. Whatever fleeting curiosity the king may feel toward you now will fade the moment he remembers his responsibilities to this kingdom. He needs a Luna who can strengthen his alliances, protect his territory, and stand beside him as an equal. He does not need a servant girl who happened to catch his eye during a moment of distraction." Elena felt anger rise in her chest, hot and sudden, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "I have no expectations regarding His Majesty's attention, my lady. I am simply a maid, and I intend to remain one, content with my duties and nothing more." Something flickered across Seraphina's expression, perhaps surprise at Elena's composure, though it vanished quickly behind her practiced smile. "See that you do," she said, before turning and gliding back toward the ballroom, her crimson gown trailing behind her like a warning made visible. Elena remained in the quiet corner for a long moment, her heart still racing, though now for reasons entirely different from before. She told herself that Seraphina's words meant nothing, that she had no reason to feel threatened by a noble woman's jealousy over an interest that surely did not exist. But some small, quiet part of her, a part she rarely allowed herself to listen to, wondered if perhaps Seraphina had noticed something Elena herself had been too afraid to fully acknowledge. She returned to her duties for the remainder of the evening, though her thoughts remained scattered, drifting between the demands of her work and the memory of dark eyes finding hers across a crowded ballroom. As the night wore on, and guests began retiring to their chambers, Elena found herself near the ballroom's grand doors, helping to extinguish the last of the candles, when a familiar voice spoke quietly behind her. "You left before I had the chance to speak with you." Elena turned quickly, nearly dropping the candle snuffer in her hand, to find King Damien standing only a few feet away, his formal jacket removed, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows in a manner far more casual than anything the court had witnessed that evening. Up close, away from the noise and spectacle of the ballroom, he seemed different somehow, less like the imposing Alpha King, and more like a man who had spent an exhausting evening performing a role he had not fully chosen for himself. "Your Majesty," Elena said, quickly lowering into a proper curtsy, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Forgive me. I did not realize you wished to speak with me." "There is nothing to forgive," Damien said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, carrying none of the commanding authority he used in front of his court. "I simply wanted to ask how you have been, since the incident in the training yard." "I have been well, Your Majesty. Thank you for your concern." He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through the careful composure she had built around herself. "You seem troubled tonight," he said finally, Has someone said something to upset you? Elena hesitated, uncertain whether it would be wise to mention her conversation with Lady Seraphina. It is nothing worth troubling you with, Your Majesty. I am simply tired from the evening's work. Something in his expression suggested he did not entirely believe her, but he did not press the matter further. Instead, he glanced around the emptying ballroom, at the last few servants extinguishing candles and clearing away the remnants of the celebration, and something almost wistful crossed his features. Do you know, he said quietly, that in 3 years of hosting this ball, tonight is the first time I have felt anything close to genuine conversation with another person in this palace. Elena did not know how to respond to such an admission, especially from a king surrounded by hundreds of guests who had spent the entire evening desperately trying to earn even a fraction of his attention. Surely that cannot be true, Your Majesty. So many people wish to speak with you tonight. They wish to speak with the Alpha King, Damien said, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. Not with me. There is a difference, though few people in this palace seem to understand it. Elena felt something shift in her chest, a strange, unexpected tenderness toward a man the entire kingdom viewed as untouchable, unshakable, carved from stone rather than flesh and blood. Perhaps, she said carefully, it is difficult for people to see past the crown when it shines so brightly. Damien's smile deepened slightly, reaching his eyes for the first time that evening. That is a kind way of saying they only see what they want to see. I did not mean to be unkind, Your Majesty. You were not unkind, he said. You were honest. It is a rare quality in this palace. They stood together for a moment longer, the emptying ballroom growing quiet around them, until one of Damien's advisors appeared at the far end of the hall, calling for his attention, regarding some matter of state that could not wait until morning. Damien sighed, the momentary lightness in his expression fading back into the composed mask of duty. I should attend to this, he said, but I am glad we spoke tonight, Elena Hart. He left before she could formulate a proper response, his footsteps echoing down the marble hallway, leaving Elena standing alone amid the last flickering candles of the grand ballroom, her mind spinning with questions she did not dare voice aloud, even to herself. She did not sleep well that night, replaying every word of their conversation, wondering what it meant that the most powerful man in the kingdom had sought her out, simply to ask if she was well, wondering what Lady Seraphina would do if she ever learned of this quiet exchange, and wondering, above all else, what strange and uncertain path now stretched ahead of her, one she had never imagined for herself, and was not entirely sure she was prepared to walk. Elsewhere in the palace, Damien Cross stood at the window of his private chambers, long after his advisors had finally allowed him to retire, staring out at the moonlit courtyard below, his thoughts refusing to settle into the careful order he usually commanded so easily. He thought of dark, honest eyes that held no ambition, no calculation, nothing but genuine concern and quiet courage. He thought of a voice that had told him the truth, without flattery, without artifice, without the endless political maneuvering that filled every other conversation he endured within these walls. He knew what his advisors expected of him. He knew what tradition demanded, what alliances needed strengthening, what political marriage would best serve the interests of the Northern Pack. He had spent years preparing himself to make exactly the kind of choice everyone anticipated, a choice built on strategy rather than sentiment, on duty rather than desire. But as he stood alone in the quiet darkness of his chambers, he found himself wondering, for the first time in his life, whether duty and desire truly needed to remain separate things after all. The ball had ended, the guests had retired, and the kingdom slept, unaware that its future had already begun to shift, quietly and irrevocably, in the space between a king's careful mask and the honest eyes of a maid who had never once tried to win his favor, and perhaps, for exactly that reason, had won it anyway. The final night of celebrations arrived 3 days later, the evening the entire kingdom had been waiting for since the announcement of the Alpha King's ball. This was the night Damien Cross would formally choose his Luna, and the palace had transformed itself once more into something even grander than before, as though determined to mark the occasion with every possible extravagance. Elena had barely slept in the days leading up to the event, her mind returning again and again to the quiet conversation she had shared with the king after the previous ball, replaying his words, his tired smile, the strange honesty that had passed between them in a hallway lit only by dying candlelight. She told herself repeatedly that it had meant nothing, that a king exhausted from an evening of performance had simply sought a moment of genuine conversation, and that she would be foolish to imagine it as anything more. And yet, some quiet part of her refused to let go of the memory. Grace had noticed the change in her, the distracted way Elena moved through her duties, the faraway look that sometimes crossed her face when she thought no one was watching. "You have not been yourself these past few days," Grace observed as they prepared the ballroom for the final celebration, arranging the last of the flowers along the grand staircase. "Did something happen after the ball that you have not told me?" "Nothing worth mentioning," Elena said, though her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. Grace studied her for a long moment, then simply squeezed her hand, a small gesture of quiet understanding that required no further explanation. "Whatever happens tonight," she said, "I hope you find some measure of peace with it." Elena did not fully understand what Grace meant until later that evening, when the ballroom filled once more with nobility from across the Northern Pax territories, all gathered to witness the moment their king would finally announce his choice. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, every conversation hushed with speculation, every gaze drawn repeatedly toward the grand doors through which the king would soon enter. Lady Seraphina Vale had outdone even her previous appearance, arriving in a gown of deep gold that seemed to catch and hold every flicker of candlelight in the room. She moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who considered the evening's outcome already decided, accepting congratulations from noble families, eager to align themselves with the woman they assumed would soon become their Luna. Elena watched from her position along the edges of the ballroom, carrying a tray of refreshments, her heart heavy with an emotion she refused to name. Of course Seraphina would be chosen. She possessed everything a Luna required: noble blood, political influence, effortless grace, and a family capable of strengthening the Northern Pax position among its rival territories. Elena possessed none of these things. She was simply a maid, an orphan, with no family name worth mentioning, no dowry, no political value whatsoever. She told herself this firmly, repeatedly, as the evening progressed, trying to prepare her heart for whatever announcement was soon to come. When King Damien finally entered the ballroom, the entire gathering fell into a hush, so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. He wore formal black attire trimmed with silver, a crown resting upon his dark hair, and though his expression remained carefully composed, Elena thought she detected something different in the set of his shoulders tonight, something almost like tension held tightly in check. The orchestra began to play, and tradition demanded that the king open the evening's dancing with a single dance, before making his formal announcement. Every eligible noblewoman in the room straightened, hope flickering across dozens of faces, each one silently praying to be chosen for this final symbolic dance, before the king revealed his decision. Damien moved through the crowd, and Elena watched, her chest tight, as he approached Lady Seraphina, who smiled with barely contained triumph, already extending her hand toward him. But he did not take it. Instead, he continued walking, past Seraphina, past dozens of other hopeful noble daughters, past advisors whose expressions shifted from confusion to open shock, moving with quiet, deliberate purpose toward the edge of the ballroom where the servants stood, careful to remain unseen. Toward Elena. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath as Damien Cross stopped directly in front of her, extending his hand with the same calm certainty he might have shown addressing a matter of state. "Elena Hart," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the room. "Will you dance with me?" For a moment, Elena could not move, could not breathe, could not process the impossible reality unfolding before her. Behind her, she heard the sharp intake of breath from other servants, and beyond that, the growing murmur of disbelief rippling through the assembled nobility. Somewhere in the crowd, she thought she heard someone laugh, a sharp, mocking sound quickly hushed by those around them, though not quickly enough to go unnoticed. "Your Majesty," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. "I am only a maid. Surely you meant to ask another." "I meant exactly what I said," Damien replied, his dark eyes steady on hers, unwavering despite the growing whispers surrounding them. "Will you dance with me, Elena?" She looked past him, just once, and saw the ballroom full of faces staring back at her, some curious, many scornful, a few openly hostile. She saw Lady Seraphina's expression shift from shock to something colder, sharper, a dangerous calculation replacing her earlier triumph. She saw nobles leaning close to whisper behind their fans, their laughter barely restrained, clearly certain they were witnessing some strange, temporary madness that would surely pass once the king came to his senses. But when she looked back at Damien, she saw none of that uncertainty reflected in his own expression. He simply waited, his hand still extended, patient despite the growing spectacle surrounding them, as though nothing else in the entire ballroom mattered beyond her answer. Elena set down her tray with trembling hands and placed her palm in his. The moment their hands touched, a hush fell over the crowd so complete that the only sound remaining was the soft rustle of silk as Damien led her toward the center of the ballroom floor. Elena felt every eye in the room fixed upon her, felt the weight of 1,000 silent judgments pressing against her skin. And yet somehow, when the music began and Damien drew her gently into the first steps of the dance, all of that noise seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant. "You are trembling," Damien said quietly, his voice meant only for her. "I have never felt so many eyes upon me in my entire life, Your Majesty," Elena admitted, her voice barely steady. "Then look at me instead of them," he said, and let the rest of the room disappear. She lifted her gaze to meet his, and found that his words, impossibly, worked exactly as he intended. The mocking whispers, the scandalized gasps, the sharp, calculating stare of Lady Serafina watching from the edge of the crowd, all of it faded into a distant hum, as Elena focused instead on the steady warmth of his hand against her waist, the quiet certainty in his dark eyes, the surprising gentleness with which he guided her through steps she had never formally learned but somehow found herself following without difficulty. "Why me?" she asked softly, unable to hold the question back any longer. "Why would you choose to dance with a maid, in front of the entire kingdom, when you know what it will cost you?" Damien's expression softened, something raw and honest breaking through the careful composure he wore, like armor in every other moment of his public life. "Because I have spent 3 years in this palace, surrounded by people who want something from me," he said quietly. "Alliances, favors, influence, power. Every smile directed at me carries a calculation behind it. Every kind word hides an ambition. You are the first person in a very long time who has looked at me and seen simply a man, rather than a crown to be won. I am no one, Your Majesty. I have nothing to offer you, no family name, no political value, nothing that a Luna is meant to bring to her king." "You are wrong," Damien said, his voice quiet but absolutely certain. "You have honesty. You have courage. You have a heart that refuses to look away from suffering, even when looking away would be far easier and far safer. I have watched you for months, Elena, long before that morning in the training yard, and every single time, I have seen the same thing. Someone who does the right thing, not because it will be rewarded, but simply because it is right." Elena's breath caught, tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, as the weight of his words settled over her. "You have been watching me for months? Since the day I saw you sit with a sick stable boy through an entire night, holding his hand and telling him stories to keep his mind off his pain, long after your duties for the day had ended, and no one would have known if you simply left him alone." Damien's voice grew softer still, almost reverent. "I asked who you were that night, and I have not stopped thinking about the answer since." The dance continued around them, though Elena barely registered the movement of her own feet. So overwhelmed was she by the enormity of what was unfolding. She was aware, distantly, that the music had begun to slow, signaling the approach of the moment every noble in the ballroom had been anxiously awaiting. As the final notes of the dance faded, Damien did not release her hand. Instead, he turned to face the gathered nobility, keeping Elena beside him despite the visible shock rippling through the crowd, despite the furious, disbelieving expression now barely contained on Lady Serafina's face. "I know this is not the announcement many of you expected tonight," Damien said, his voice carrying easily through the silent ballroom, commanding attention without needing to raise its volume. "I know tradition and expectation have led this kingdom to believe I would choose a Luna, based on lineage and political advantage. But I have spent 3 years watching this court, watching the way power reshapes people, watching ambition replace kindness in even the gentlest hearts. And in all that time, I have found exactly one person whose character has never wavered, whose kindness has never been performance, and whose courage has never depended on an audience. He turned to look at Elena, his expression open in a way she had never witnessed from him before, vulnerable despite the crown resting upon his head, and the eyes of the entire kingdom fixed upon them both. "Elena Hart," he said, "I choose you as my Luna." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd, some voices rising in outrage, others in confusion. A few, mostly among the servants gathered along the walls, rising in quiet, disbelieving joy. Lady Seraphina's composed mask shattered entirely, her face contorting with fury, before she forced it back into something resembling calm, though her eyes remained sharp with barely contained rage, as she stared across the room at Elena. An elderly advisor stepped forward, his face pale with alarm. "Your Majesty, surely you understand the implications of such a choice. A maid cannot become Luna. The pack requires strength, lineage, political." "The pack requires a leader worthy of trust," Damien interrupted, his voice hardening with the authority Elena had witnessed in the training yard days before. "And I have found no one in this kingdom more worthy of that trust than the woman standing beside me. My decision is final." Elena stood frozen at his side, overwhelmed by the storm of reactions surrounding her, by the weight of what had just occurred, by the impossible reality that she, an orphaned maid with no family name and no claim to nobility, had just been named Luna of the Northern Pack, before the eyes of the entire kingdom. She caught Grace's gaze across the room, the young kitchen girl's face streaked with tears of joy, mouthing silent, disbelieving congratulations. She caught Ronan's approving nod, the guard's expression carrying quiet respect, rather than the shock displayed by so many others in the room. And she caught, briefly, the burning fury in Lady Seraphina's eyes, before the noblewoman turned and swept from the ballroom, her golden gown trailing behind her, like a warning of storms yet to come. "Are you certain of this?" Elena whispered to Damien, once the immediate chaos had begun to settle into a low, constant murmur of scandalized conversation. "You have made an enemy of every noble family who hoped their daughter would stand where I stand now." "I have made a choice that felt more honest than any decision I have made in my entire life," Damien replied quietly. "The rest, we will face together." Together. The word settled into Elena's chest, with a warmth she had never experienced before. A promise that felt both terrifying and impossibly precious. She did not yet know what challenges awaited them, what enemies would rise from the wounded pride of noble families denied their expected prize, what secrets from her own hidden past might yet resurface to threaten the fragile happiness now blooming unexpectedly before her. She only knew that as the ballroom slowly emptied of shocked and whispering guests, as the candles burned lower and the night grew quiet around them, she stood beside a king who had chosen her not for her lineage or her wealth, but simply for who she was, and for the first time in her entire life, Elena Hart allowed herself to believe that perhaps she truly did deserve something wonderful. Outside the ballroom, in shadowed corridors where whispers traveled faster than any official announcement, the news spread through the palace like wildfire, reaching servants and nobles alike, each retelling colored by disbelief, admiration, or fury, depending on who told the tale. And in a private chamber far from the celebration, Lady Seraphina Vale sat before her mirror, her golden gown discarded on the floor, her expression no longer composed, but twisted, with a rage that promised the beginning of a battle Elena Hart did not yet know she would have to fight. The kingdom had witnessed its king's choice, but the story of Elena Hart, Maid turned Luna, had only just begun. Morning arrived with a strange, unfamiliar quiet, the kind that follows a storm rather than precedes one. Elena woke in a chamber far grander than the narrow servants' quarters she had known for 3 years, a room with tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, silk sheets soft against her skin, and for a moment, disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings, she wondered if the previous night had simply been an elaborate dream conjured by exhaustion and hope. Then she saw the gown from the ball still draped over a chair, and she remembered. She was Luna now, or she would be, once the formal mating ceremony was completed, a ritual that traditionally took place weeks or even months after a king's announcement, allowing time for the chosen Luna to prepare, to learn the responsibilities of her new position, and for the pack to formally accept their new leader. Elena understood, even in her first waking moments in this unfamiliar chamber, that acceptance would not come easily, not from a court still reeling with shock and wounded pride. A soft knock sounded at her door, and Grace entered, practically vibrating with barely contained excitement, though she quickly composed herself into something more appropriately reserved, remembering perhaps that Elena's new position required a different kind of deference between them now. "You do not need to bow to me, Grace," Elena said quickly, seeing her friend hesitate at the threshold. "You are still the same friend who found me in a hallway 3 years ago and taught me where to find the best bread in the kitchens. Please, come in." Relief flooded Grace's expression, and she hurried forward, embracing Elena tightly, before either of them could think better of it. "I still cannot believe it happened," Grace whispered. "The entire palace is speaking of nothing else." Some of the kitchen staff wept with joy when they heard. Others, she hesitated. Others are frightened of what the noble families might do. Elena's stomach tightened. "What have you heard?" Grace's expression grew more serious. "Lady Serafina left the palace before dawn, returning to her family's estate, but it is said her father, Lord Vale, has already sent messages to several other noble houses, gathering support for some kind of formal challenge to the king's decision. Can they truly challenge his choice?" "I do not know the full laws of pack succession," Grace admitted, "but I know powerful families do not accept humiliation quietly, and losing the position of Luna to a servant girl is precisely the kind of humiliation Lord Vale will not forgive easily." Elena sat heavily on the edge of her new bed, the weight of the situation settling over her more fully, now that the initial shock and wonder of the previous evening had faded into the sober light of morning. She had known, even as she placed her hand in Damien's the night before, that accepting his choice would invite conflict. She had not fully understood, until this moment, how quickly and how seriously that conflict might begin. A second knock interrupted her thoughts, this one firmer, more formal. When Elena opened the door, she found an elderly woman standing in the hallway, dressed in fine but understated robes, her silver hair pulled back into a severe knot, her expression carrying the particular sternness of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You must be Elena Hart," the woman said, her voice carrying the same commanding quality Elena had noticed in Damien, though colder, more measured. "I am Livia Cross, the king's mother." Elena's breath caught, and she immediately dropped into a proper curtsy, her heart pounding with sudden nervousness. "Your Majesty, I did not expect—" "Rise," Livia said, though not unkindly. "I have come to see for myself the young woman who has thrown my son's court into such chaos." Elena straightened slowly, uncertain what to expect, bracing herself for judgment or disapproval. Instead, she found Livia studying her, with an expression more curious than hostile, her sharp eyes moving over Elena's face, as though searching for something specific. "My son tells me you defended a kitchen maid against a nobleman's cruelty, without hesitation, despite knowing the risk to yourself," Livia said finally. "He tells me you looked him in the eye during that confrontation, and did not flinch, even though everyone else in that yard trembled at the mere thought of displeasing him. I only did what seemed right, Your Majesty." "That," Livia said, "is precisely why my son chose you. Do you understand, girl, how rare it is to find someone in this palace who acts from genuine conviction rather than calculation? I have watched noble daughters parade through this court for years, each one more skilled than the last at performing whatever virtue they believed would win my son's favor. Not one of them ever moved me the way the story of your defiance in that training yard moved me, and I was not even present to witness it myself." Elena felt something loosen slightly in her chest, a small measure of hope that perhaps not everyone in the palace viewed her new position as an outrage to be corrected. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I did not expect such kindness from you." "Do not mistake kindness for blind approval," Livia said, her tone sharpening slightly. "I believe my son has chosen well, but belief is not the same as certainty, and the path ahead of you will not be easy. Lord Vale and his allies will not accept this decision quietly. There are laws and traditions surrounding pack succession that even a king cannot simply override with personal preference, and you will need to prove yourself worthy of this position, not only to my son, but to an entire kingdom that currently views you with suspicion at best and outright hostility at worst." "What must I do?" Elena asked, steadying her voice despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Learn," Livia said simply. "Learn the history of this pack, the responsibilities of a Luna, the delicate politics that hold our territories together, Learn quickly, and learn well, because you will be tested, Elena Hart, in ways you cannot yet imagine. And know this, Livia added, her expression softening slightly. Whatever tests come, my son has never in his entire life shown the kind of certainty he showed last night, choosing you before the eyes of this court, despite every political disadvantage such a choice carries. That certainty matters more than you may currently understand. Livia left as formally as she had arrived, leaving Elena alone with Grace once more, both of them processing the weight of everything that had just been said. She is not what I expected, Elena admitted quietly. No one in this story is quite what anyone expected, Grace replied with a small, tired smile. Over the following days, Elena found herself thrust into an entirely new existence, one that bore little resemblance to the quiet, predictable rhythms of her life as a maid. She began daily lessons with an elderly advisor named Edmund, a patient man with kind eyes who taught her the history of the Northern Pack, the delicate web of alliances and rivalries that connected the territory's noble families, and the formal responsibilities expected of a Luna, standing beside her Alpha King. She learned that the position of Luna carried genuine political weight, that a Luna was expected to mediate disputes between noble houses, oversee the welfare of the pack's most vulnerable members, and stand as a symbol of unity and strength beside her mate. She learned that generations of tradition expected a Luna to come from noble bloodlines specifically because such lineage was believed to carry inherited wisdom and authority, a belief Elena's own presence now directly challenged. She also began spending time with Damien himself, though their meetings remained carefully chaperoned by advisors mindful of propriety, brief windows of conversation snatched between his duties governing the pack and her own exhausting lessons. Despite the limitations placed upon their time together, Elena found herself looking forward to these moments more than she cared to admit, small exchanges that reminded her of the honest conversation they had shared after the first ball, before either of them had understood what their connection might eventually become. "You seem exhausted," Damien observed one evening, finding her in the palace library, where she had fallen asleep over a heavy volume, detailing the historical treaties between the Northern Pack and its neighboring territories. "Edmund says I must understand 300 years of history before I can properly understand the present," Elena admitted, rubbing tired eyes. "I fear I am not learning quickly enough." "You are learning faster than anyone expected," Damien said, settling into the chair beside her, despite the disapproving glance from a nearby advisor, who clearly believed such casual proximity was inappropriate before their formal mating ceremony. "Edmund has told me himself that your understanding of pack politics already surpasses several noble daughters who spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this role." "I do not feel as though I am succeeding," Elena said quietly. "Every day, I feel the weight of everyone's expectations, everyone's judgment, wondering if I will fail, wondering if your choice will prove to be the mistake so many believe it to be." Damien reached out, gently taking her hand, a small gesture that nonetheless carried enormous weight, given the careful boundaries surrounding their courtship. "Elena, listen to me. I have led this pack for 3 years. I have made difficult decisions, faced dangerous enemies, and carried the weight of an entire kingdom's survival on my shoulders. In all that time, I have never once doubted a decision, the way I feared I might doubt choosing you, and yet every single day since that ball, I have grown more certain, not less, that I made the right choice." "How can you be so certain?" Elena asked softly. "Because true strength was never about lineage or noble blood," Damien said. "It has always been about character, about the willingness to do what is right, even when it is difficult, even when it is costly. You have shown me more of that quality in the short time I have known you than most nobles show in their entire lives spent chasing power and status." Elena felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice, the quiet conviction that had never once wavered despite the growing storm of opposition surrounding their union. "I hope I can prove myself worthy of that faith," she whispered. "You already have," Damien replied simply. But even as their bond deepened through these quiet, stolen moments, storm clouds continued gathering beyond the palace walls. Word arrived that Lord Vale had begun formally rallying support among the Northern Pack's noble families, citing ancient laws regarding pack succession that some scholars argued required a Luna to possess verified noble lineage. Whispers spread that Lady Seraphina, humiliated before the entire kingdom, had vowed to see Elena removed from her position by whatever means necessary, regardless of the personal cost. And in the palace's deepest archives, hidden among records few had cause to examine, a single forgotten document waited to be discovered, one that would reveal a truth about Elena's own hidden past, far more significant than anyone, including Elena herself, could possibly have imagined. The kingdom held its breath, uncertain whether it stood at the beginning of a new era of hope, or the opening chapter of a conflict that would test every bond of loyalty and love within the Northern Pack. 2 weeks after the ball, a messenger arrived at the palace gates, carrying news that would change everything Elena thought she understood about her own life. The messenger, a travel-worn man named Corwin, came from a distant village called Ashford Hollow, a small settlement nestled at the edge of the Northern Pack's territory, close to lands once controlled by a rival pack that had been destroyed nearly 20 years earlier, during a conflict Elena had only ever heard mentioned in hushed, uncertain tones. Corwin requested an audience with the palace's chief archivist, claiming to carry documents relevant to the ongoing dispute over Elena's legitimacy as Luna, documents he insisted needed to be examined before Lord Vale's formal challenge could proceed any further. Edmund, Elena's patient tutor, brought the matter directly to Damien's attention, and within hours, Elena found herself summoned to the palace's private council chamber, a room she had entered only once before, during the early days of her lessons, when Edmund had shown her the vast collection of historical treaties stored within its walls. Damien sat at the head of a long table, his expression unusually guarded, flanked by Edmund and his mother Livia, whose sharp eyes studied Elena carefully as she entered the room. Corwin stood near the far wall, a worn leather satchel clutched against his chest, his weathered face carrying an expression of nervous determination. "Elena," Damien said, gesturing toward an empty chair beside him, "please sit. Corwin has traveled a great distance to bring us information that may prove significant to your situation." Elena took her seat, her heart already beginning to race with uncertain anticipation. "What kind of information?" Corwin stepped forward, opening his satchel with careful, almost reverent hands. "Your Majesty, my lady, I must first explain who I am. I served as a healer in Ashford Hollow for many years, in the territory that once belonged to the Hartwell Pack, before its destruction, during the conflicts 19 years ago." Elena's breath caught. Hart, her surname. She had never known its origin, had simply carried it her entire life without question, assuming it to be nothing more significant than the name given to an abandoned infant by whichever orphanage had first taken her in. "I recognized your face the moment I heard the description spreading through the villages," Corwin continued, his voice growing thick with emotion. "You bear a striking resemblance to Lady Marianne Hartwell, the last surviving daughter of the Hartwell Pack's ruling family, who vanished during the final battle that destroyed her people 19 years ago, carrying an infant daughter with her into the forest as her territory burned around her." The room fell utterly silent. Elena felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her. Every certainty she had ever held about her own identity suddenly cast into question. "You believe I am that infant," Elena said slowly, barely able to voice the words. "I do not simply believe it, my lady," Corwin said, withdrawing a small, worn locket from his satchel and placing it carefully on the table before her. "I know it. This locket belonged to Lady Marianne. I found it near the edge of the forest 3 days after the battle, along with signs that a wounded woman had passed through the area carrying a small child. I searched for months, hoping to find survivors, but eventually accepted that they had likely perished along with the rest of their people." With trembling hands, Elena opened the small locket and found inside a tiny, faded portrait of a woman with dark eyes and gentle features that bore an unmistakable resemblance to her own reflection in every mirror she had ever glanced into throughout her life. "I do not understand," Elena whispered. "If my mother survived the battle, why did she never return to reclaim her territory? Why did I grow up believing myself an orphan with no family at all?" Livia, who had remained silent throughout Corwin's explanation, spoke quietly from her seat at the table. "Because the Hartwell Pack was not simply destroyed by chance, child. It was betrayed." Elena turned to look at her, seeing something heavy and pained settling over the older woman's usually composed expression. "Betrayed by whom?" Livia hesitated, glancing briefly at her son before answering. "By my husband, Damien's father." The words hung in the air like a physical weight, and Elena watched as Damien's expression shifted from confusion to something far darker, a dawning horror that clearly matched her own. "Explain," Damien said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Livia drew a long, steadying breath before continuing. 19 years ago, the Hartwell Pack controlled valuable territory along our northern border, territory rich in resources your father desperately wanted for the growing needs of our own pack. Rather than pursue honest negotiation, he formed a secret alliance with rival forces, orchestrating a conflict designed to weaken the Hartwell Pack beyond recovery, allowing him to claim their territory once their defenses had fallen. I did not learn the full truth of what he had done until years later, long after the Hartwell Pack had already been destroyed, their surviving members scattered or killed, their ruling family presumed lost entirely. "Why did you never speak of this?" Damien demanded, his voice carrying an edge of anger Elena had rarely heard from him. "Because your father ensured the truth was buried alongside every witness who might have revealed it," Livia said quietly. "I only pieced together the full story through fragments discovered after his death, evidence I chose to keep hidden, fearing what such knowledge might do to a kingdom already struggling to maintain stability during your early years as Alpha King." Elena sat frozen, absorbing the enormity of what she had just learned. Her family, an entire pack of people, had been destroyed, not through the chaos of unavoidable conflict, but through deliberate betrayal, orchestrated by the father of the very man who had chosen her as his Luna. The irony of it settled over her like a physical weight, dark and disorienting. "If this is true," Elena said slowly, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the storm of emotion building within her, "then I am not simply a maid the king chose out of affection. I am the heir of a pack his own father destroyed." "Yes," Livia said simply. "Does this mean I have some rightful claim to territory, to political standing that Lord Vale and his allies cannot dispute?" Elena asked, a strange, uncertain hope beginning to flicker, despite the pain of everything else she had just learned. Edmund, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, spoke carefully. "It is possible, my lady. Ancient pack law does recognize inherited claims, even after decades of displacement, provided sufficient evidence can be presented and verified. If Corwin's testimony can be confirmed through additional evidence, and if the locket can be authenticated as genuinely belonging to Lady Marianne Hartwell, then your legitimacy as a noble heir, rather than a simple maid, could be formally established." "This could end Lord Vale's challenge entirely," Damien said, though his expression remained troubled despite the potential political advantage such news represented. "But Elena, I must ask, how do you feel, learning that my own father is responsible for the destruction of your family, for whatever suffering led you to grow up believing yourself an orphan, with no history at all?" Elena considered the question carefully, feeling the weight of 19 years of unanswered questions finally beginning to find their painful resolution. "I feel many things at once," she admitted quietly. "Grief for a mother I never knew I lost, anger at a betrayal that stole an entire life from me before I was even old enough to understand what I had lost, and confusion about what any of this means for us now." "You have every right to feel angry toward my family," Damien said, his voice heavy with genuine remorse. "Toward me even, simply by association. I do not blame you for your father's actions," Elena said, though she could hear the uncertainty still lingering in her own voice. "But I will need time to understand what all of this means, for myself and for us." Damien nodded slowly, respecting the need she had expressed, though Elena could see the fear flickering briefly behind his careful composure, the fear that this revelation might create a distance between them neither of them had anticipated needing to overcome. Over the following days, Elena retreated frequently into quiet solitude, processing the enormity of everything she had learned. She spent hours in the palace library, poring over what few historical records remained regarding the Hartwell Pack, learning fragments of a heritage that had been stolen from her before she was even old enough to form memories of her own family. She learned that the Hartwell Pack had been known throughout the region for their skilled healers and their deep connection to the land, values that felt strangely familiar, despite Elena having no conscious memory of ever being taught them. She learned, too, through careful questioning of Corwin, that her mother had likely died shortly after fleeing the destruction of her territory, succumbing either to injuries sustained during the battle or to the harsh conditions of surviving alone in unfamiliar wilderness while protecting an infant daughter. Elena had apparently been discovered, alone and abandoned, near the outskirts of a small village, several weeks after the Hartwell Pack's destruction, taken in by an orphanage that had no knowledge of her true heritage, and given the surname Hart, a truncated echo of the family name she had unknowingly carried her entire life, without understanding its significance. "I wish I could tell you more," Corwin said gently, during one of Elena's many conversations with him before his eventual return to Ashford Hollow. "But I searched for you myself, all those years ago, and found nothing beyond the locket and a trail that eventually went cold. I had given up hope of ever finding Lady Marianne's daughter alive, until word reached my village of a maid who had captured the Alpha King's attention through an act of quiet courage." "Thank you," Elena said, genuinely grateful despite the painful nature of the truth he had brought her, "for searching all those years ago, and for coming forward now, even knowing the political complications your testimony might create." "I owed it to Lady Marianne's memory," Corwin said simply. "She was kind to my family long before the conflict destroyed everything her people had built. I could not in good conscience remain silent once I learned her daughter might still be alive." As Elena slowly began processing her new understanding of her own identity, her relationship with Damien underwent its own quiet transformation. Where their earlier connection had been built on stolen moments of honest conversation and mutual admiration, it now carried the added complexity of a shared history neither of them had chosen, a betrayal that connected their families in ways that would require careful, patient healing to fully overcome. "I keep wondering," Elena admitted one evening, as they sat together in the palace gardens, careful distance maintained between them, despite the quiet intimacy of their conversation, "whether choosing me was truly a matter of your own heart, or whether some part of you always sensed a connection to my family, some unconscious guilt drawing you toward correcting a wrong you did not even know your father had committed." Damien considered the question seriously before answering. "I chose you before I knew any of this, Elena. I chose you because of who you are, the courage and honesty I witnessed with my own eyes, long before Corwin ever arrived at our gates. Learning about my father's betrayal does not change why I chose you. If anything, it only deepens my determination to make right whatever wrongs my family has caused, not because guilt demands it, but because you deserve nothing less than the truth, and the restoration of what was stolen from you. And if learning the full truth changes how I feel about you?" Elena asked quietly, voicing the fear she had carried since first learning of Livia's confession. "If some part of me cannot separate you from what your father did to my family, then I will understand," Damien said, though pain flickered visibly across his expression at the possibility. "I will not ask you to forgive a betrayal that was never yours to forgive on my father's behalf, nor mine to seek forgiveness for on his account. I only hope, in time, that what exists between us can prove strong enough to carry the weight of this history, rather than being crushed beneath it." Elena reached across the careful distance between them, taking his hand in hers, a small gesture that nonetheless carried enormous significance, given everything they had just learned. "I do not blame you, Damien. I never will. What I feel for you exists separately from what your father did to my family, though I will need time to fully reconcile both truths within my own heart." "Take whatever time you need," Damien said softly. "I am not going anywhere." But even as Elena and Damien worked to navigate the complicated new reality of her hidden heritage, word of Corwin's revelation had already begun spreading beyond the palace walls, carried by servants and advisors to noble families, eager for any information that might strengthen or weaken their political position. Lord Vale, upon learning that Elena might possess a legitimate noble claim capable of undermining his entire challenge to her position as Luna, began quietly exploring far more desperate and dangerous measures to ensure his daughter's path to the throne remained unobstructed, regardless of the cost such measures might ultimately demand. And in a private chamber within her family's grand estate, Lady Seraphina Vale listened to reports of Elena's newly discovered heritage, with an expression that shifted slowly from fury to cold, calculating determination, already beginning to formulate a plan that would ensure the maid who had humiliated her before the entire kingdom would never live to claim the title of Luna, regardless of whatever hidden nobility now flowed through her blood. The storm that had begun gathering the moment Damien chose Elena over Seraphina was about to break in earnest, and neither Elena nor Damien yet understood how dangerous the coming days would prove to be. 3 weeks after Corwin's revelation, Lord Vale summoned his closest allies to a private meeting within his family's grand estate, a gathering conducted with the kind of careful secrecy usually reserved for matters of war rather than court politics. Lady Seraphina sat at her father's side, her earlier fury refined now into something colder and far more dangerous, a patient determination that had replaced her initial outrage with methodical calculation. The Maid's claim to Hartwell heritage cannot be allowed to stand unchallenged, Lord Vale said, addressing the small gathering of noble allies seated around his private council table. If her lineage is formally recognized, our entire challenge to her position as Luna collapses entirely, and my daughter's rightful place at the king's side will be lost forever. The evidence Corwin presented seemed convincing, one of the assembled nobles observed cautiously. The locket, the resemblance to Lady Marianne, the timing of her discovery near the destroyed Hartwell territory. Formal verification may already be underway. Then we must ensure that verification never reaches completion, Seraphina said quietly, her voice carrying an edge that made several nobles in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. Corwin traveled alone from Ashford Hollow. He carries no additional witnesses, no corroborating testimony beyond his own memory, and a single locket that could easily have been acquired through less honest means. You suggest we discredit his testimony entirely, Lord Vale said, studying his daughter with something between pride and concern. I suggest we ensure the archivists, tasked with verifying this claim, find reasons to doubt it, Seraphina replied. Documents can be questioned, memories can be challenged as unreliable after 19 years, and if additional evidence should happen to surface, evidence that casts doubt on the Maid's true origins, I do not believe anyone in this room would object to its convenient timing. Lord Vale studied his daughter for a long moment, before nodding slowly, understanding the implications of her suggestion without requiring further explanation. I will speak with Lord Ashworth regarding the palace archives. He has long owed our family several favors, and this seems an appropriate time to call upon them. The conspiracy that formed that evening within Lord Vale's private council chamber would set into motion a series of events far more dangerous than Elena or Damien could have anticipated, a quiet campaign of deception designed not simply to challenge Elena's legitimacy, but to destroy it entirely, regardless of the human cost such destruction might require. Within days, subtle changes began appearing throughout the palace. Elena noticed servants who had once greeted her warmly, now offering only careful, distant courtesy, their eyes avoiding hers in ways that suggested rumors had begun circulating that made them uncertain how to treat her. Edmund, during their daily lessons, seemed increasingly troubled, though he offered no explanation when Elena asked if something concerning had occurred. It was Grace who eventually brought her the troubling news, finding Elena in the palace gardens during a rare moment of solitude. There is talk spreading through the kitchens, Grace said, her expression tight with worry. Some claim that Corwin's testimony has been called into question, that the palace archivists have found irregularities in the documents he provided. What kind of irregularities? Elena asked, her stomach tightening with sudden unease. I do not know the full details, Grace admitted. But I overheard 2 advisors discussing a letter that arrived recently, one claiming to be from a healer who once served alongside Corwin in Ashford Hollow, alleging that Corwin had a history of fabricating stories for personal gain, that he had once attempted to claim a false inheritance from a wealthy family, years before he ever traveled here to speak with the king. Elena felt a cold dread settle over her, recognizing immediately the convenient timing of such an accusation. This letter arrived shortly after Corwin's testimony began threatening Lord Vale's challenge. I believe so, my lady, Grace confirmed. Elena brought her concerns directly to Damien that evening, finding him in his private study, surrounded by documents related to the ongoing dispute over her legitimacy. I have seen the letter, Damien said grimly, gesturing toward a parchment resting on his desk. It arrived 3 days ago, claiming Corwin has a history of deception. Edmund has been investigating its origins, but so far, we cannot determine who actually sent it, nor whether its claims hold any truth at all. You believe it may be false, Elena said, more statement than question. I believe the timing is too convenient to be coincidence, Damien replied. But without concrete evidence proving the letter itself is fabricated, we cannot simply dismiss it. especially with Lord Vale's allies already using it to argue that your entire claim to Hartwell heritage should be considered unreliable. Elena sank into a chair across from his desk, exhaustion and frustration warring within her chest. It feels as though every time we make progress toward proving my legitimacy, some new obstacle appears to undermine it. Because that is precisely what is happening, Damien said, his expression darkening with barely controlled anger. Lord Vale will not accept defeat easily, Elena. He has spent his entire life building influence and power, and he will not surrender that influence without a fight, regardless of how dishonorable the methods required to wage that fight might become. Over the following days, the situation grew increasingly complicated. Edmund's investigation into the mysterious letter revealed that it had indeed originated from Ashford Hollow, but further inquiry suggested the supposed healer who claimed to have known Corwin did not actually exist within any official village records, a discrepancy that raised more questions than it answered. Meanwhile, Elena found herself facing increasingly hostile treatment from segments of the noble court, still loyal to Lord Vale's cause. During a formal council meeting she was required to attend as part of her ongoing preparation for her role as Luna, several nobles openly questioned her legitimacy, citing the disputed letter as evidence that her entire claim to Hartwell heritage might be nothing more than an elaborate deception, designed to secure her position through false pretenses. How convenient, one noblewoman remarked coldly during the meeting, that a maid with no verified history suddenly discovers herself to be the long-lost heir of a destroyed pack, precisely at the moment her legitimacy as Luna comes under serious challenge. I did not seek out this revelation, Elena replied, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the hostility surrounding her. Corwin traveled here of his own accord, recognizing my resemblance to Lady Marianne Hartwell before I had any knowledge of my own heritage. Or perhaps, the noblewoman countered, you arranged for this convenient discovery yourself, understanding that a maid with no claim to nobility would never survive Lord Vale's formal challenge. The accusation stung deeply, not simply because it was false, but because Elena recognized the impossible position she now occupied. She could offer no definitive proof beyond Corwin's testimony and a single locket, both of which had already been called into question through means she suspected, though could not yet prove, originated from Lord Vale's own campaign of deception. That evening, exhausted and disheartened, Elena found herself walking alone through the palace's quieter corridors, seeking solitude away from the growing hostility surrounding her every public appearance. She did not notice Ronan, the guard who had first directed her toward Grace's cries in the training yard weeks earlier, until he fell into step beside her. You seem troubled, my lady, Ronan observed quietly. I fear I am fighting battles I do not know how to win, Elena admitted, too exhausted to maintain her careful composure in the presence of someone who had shown her genuine kindness since the very beginning of this impossible journey. Ronan considered her words for a long moment before speaking. My lady, I have served this palace for many years, long before King Damien ascended to his position as Alpha King. I remember Lord Vale's tactics well, from disputes he waged against other noble families seeking to challenge his influence over the years. He rarely leaves evidence of his methods behind, but he is not infallible. If there is deception at work regarding this letter that has cast doubt on Corwin's testimony, I may know where to begin searching for proof. Hope flickered cautiously within Elena's chest. You would help me investigate this? I have watched you these past weeks, my lady, Ronan said, his weathered expression carrying genuine sincerity. I have seen the honest effort you have poured into learning the responsibilities of your new position, the genuine concern you have shown for every servant in this palace, regardless of your own mounting troubles. I believe you deserve the truth, whatever that truth ultimately proves to be, rather than becoming a casualty of Lord Vale's ambition. Thank you, Ronan, Elena said, genuine gratitude warming her voice despite the exhaustion weighing on her heart. I do not know how to properly express what your support means to me. You need not express anything, my lady. Simply continue being the person who defended Grace in that training yard, without hesitation, without calculation, and I will consider my assistance more than adequately repaid. Over the following days, Ronan quietly began investigating the origins of the mysterious letter, using connections built over years of palace service to trace its journey from supposed origin in Ashford Hollow to its eventual arrival within the palace's formal council chambers. His investigation moved carefully, cautiously, aware that discovery of his efforts before sufficient evidence had been gathered might alert Lord Vale's allies and allow them to further conceal whatever deception lay at the heart of the matter. Meanwhile, Damien faced his own mounting pressures, as advisors increasingly urged him to reconsider his choice of Luna, citing the growing political instability threatening to fracture the Northern Pact's carefully maintained alliances. Several noble families, previously neutral in the dispute, had begun quietly aligning themselves with Lord Vale's cause, persuaded by the mounting doubt surrounding Elena's legitimacy and concerned about the precedent set by a king choosing his Luna based on personal affection rather than political necessity. The council grows increasingly restless, Edmund reported during one particularly tense evening meeting. Several members have begun openly questioning whether Your Majesty's judgment has been compromised by personal feeling, suggesting that continuing to support Elena's claim, despite growing doubt about her legitimacy, risks fracturing the very alliances necessary to maintain the Pact's stability and security. "And what do you believe, Edmund?" Damien asked, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. Edmund considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe, Your Majesty, that Lord Vale's campaign against Elena has grown increasingly aggressive in ways that suggest genuine fear rather than confident opposition. A man secure in the strength of his position rarely resorts to the kind of shadowy deception we suspect underlies this mysterious letter. I believe the very desperation of his tactics suggests he understands, perhaps better than any of us currently do, just how strong Elena's true claim to Hartwell heritage actually is." Damien's expression eased slightly at Edmund's assessment, though the weight of political pressure surrounding him remained heavy. "Thank you, old friend. Your counsel has always proven wiser than my own instincts in moments such as these." "Then trust those instincts a little longer, Your Majesty," Edmund said gently. "Truth has a way of surfacing, even when powerful forces work diligently to bury it. That truth arrived sooner than any of them expected, though not through the means they had anticipated. Late one evening, nearly a month after Corwin's initial testimony, Ronan appeared at Elena's chamber door, his expression carrying the particular intensity of someone who had discovered something significant. "My lady," he said quietly, glancing carefully down the empty hallway before continuing, "I believe I have found proof of the deception surrounding that letter. But what I discovered reveals something far more dangerous than simple political manipulation. I believe Lord Vale's allies are planning something beyond mere doubt and discreditation, something that may put your very life at risk." Elena felt cold dread settle over her, understanding immediately that whatever Ronan had uncovered represented a far greater threat than the political challenges she had been preparing herself to face. "Show me," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear building within her chest. What Ronan revealed that night would set into motion a chain of events far more perilous than anyone within the palace had yet imagined, a conspiracy that extended beyond simple political maneuvering into territory that threatened not only Elena's claim to her rightful heritage, but her very survival within a court that had proven itself willing to abandon honor entirely in pursuit of preserving its carefully maintained power. Ronan led Elena to a small, sparsely furnished chamber in a quieter wing of the palace. A room he explained belonged to a retired guard who had once served under Lord Vale's household before transferring to the king's own service years earlier. The retired guard, an older man named Fitzgerald, sat waiting for them, his weathered face carrying the strain of someone burdened by knowledge he had carried silently for far too long. "Fitzgerald has agreed to share what he knows," Ronan explained quietly, closing the door carefully behind them. "But my lady, I must warn you. What he has to tell you extends beyond the matter of the disputed letter." Elena took a seat across from Fitzgerald, her heart pounding with uncertain anticipation. "Please, tell me what you know." Fitzgerald drew a long, steadying breath before speaking. "My lady, I served Lord Vale's household for nearly 15 years before requesting transfer to the King's Guard 3 years ago. During my time in his service, I witnessed many things I was instructed never to speak of, matters concerning how Lord Vale maintained and expanded his influence throughout the years." "Including the letter that discredited Corwin's testimony?" Elena asked. "Yes, my lady," Fitzgerald confirmed. "I recognized the hand that penned it the moment I heard rumors of its contents circulating through the palace. It belongs to a scribe named Aldrich, A man Lord Vale has employed for years specifically for the purpose of crafting documents intended to appear as though they originated elsewhere. I have seen Aldrich's work before, used to discredit rival noble families during disputes over territory and influence throughout my years of service. Cold anger settled over Elena, confirming what she had already suspected but had lacked sufficient proof to act upon. Can you provide evidence that would satisfy the palace archivists? Evidence that would prove this letter was fabricated? Fitzgerald hesitated, and Elena saw genuine fear flicker across his weathered features. My lady, that is precisely the difficulty. I have no physical proof, only my own recognition of Aldrich's handwriting, built from years of familiarity, that Lord Vale's allies could easily dismiss as unreliable, especially given my current position within the king's own service, which they would certainly argue creates bias in my testimony. Then what can be done? Elena asked, frustration building despite her efforts to remain calm. There is one possibility, Fitzgerald said slowly. Aldrich maintains a private ledger, hidden within Lord Vale's estate, recording every document he has ever crafted on the family's behalf, along with the specific purposes each deception was designed to serve. Lord Vale insists on this record being kept, I believe, as a form of leverage over Aldrich himself, ensuring the scribe's continued loyalty through the threat of exposure, should he ever attempt to betray the family's confidence. You know where this ledger is hidden? Ronan asked. I do, Fitzgerald confirmed, though retrieving it would require entering Lord Vale's private estate without permission, a risk that could have severe consequences should we be discovered. Elena considered the danger carefully, weighing the potential consequences against the growing urgency of proving her legitimacy before Lord Vale's mounting political pressure succeeded in convincing the council to formally reject her claim. I understand the risk, Fitzgerald, but if this ledger exists, and if it contains proof of Aldrich's deception, I believe we must attempt to retrieve it, regardless of the danger involved. There is more you must understand before making that decision, my lady, Fitzgerald said, his expression growing even more troubled. The reason I finally chose to come forward tonight extends beyond simply the matter of the disputed letter. I overheard a conversation between Lord Vale and Lady Seraphina 3 nights ago, discussing matters far more dangerous than mere political discreditation. Elena's breath caught. What kind of matters? Fitzgerald glanced nervously toward the door, before continuing, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They spoke of ensuring your claim to the throne would never be formally recognized, regardless of what evidence might eventually surface, supporting your Hartwell heritage. Lady Seraphina specifically mentioned that if doubt alone proved insufficient to remove you from your position, more permanent measures might become necessary before the formal mating ceremony could take place. The full weight of the threat settled over Elena like an icy wave, understanding now that she faced far more than political rivalry or wounded pride. Lady Seraphina and Lord Vale were prepared to consider harming her directly, should their campaign of doubt and deception fail to achieve their desired outcome. We must inform the king immediately, Ronan said grimly, his expression hardening with protective determination. Agreed, Elena said, though fear now coiled tightly in her chest, alongside the anger she had been carrying throughout the evening's revelations. They found Damien still awake in his private study, reviewing documents related to the ongoing political dispute despite the late hour. His expression shifted rapidly from surprise at their unexpected late-night visit to grave concern as Elena and Ronan relayed everything Fitzgerald had shared. They spoke of harming you directly? Damien said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, his hands clenching into fists against the surface of his desk. I will have Lord Vale and his daughter formally questioned regarding this threat, immediately. Your Majesty, forgive me, Ronan said carefully, but without physical proof beyond Fitzgerald's testimony, which they will certainly dismiss, given his current position within your service, such an accusation would only further inflame the political tension, already threatening to fracture the council's support. Damien's jaw tightened, clearly frustrated by the truth of Ronan's assessment. Then what do you propose we do? I cannot simply allow Elena's safety to remain at risk, while we wait for sufficient proof to satisfy a council already inclined to doubt every claim made on her behalf. I propose increased protection for Elena immediately, Ronan said, while we pursue retrieving Aldrich's hidden ledger, evidence that could simultaneously prove the letter's deception, and, potentially, reveal further documentation of whatever additional schemes Lord Vale and his daughter may be planning. Damien considered this proposal carefully, his gaze moving to Elena with visible concern. Elena, this places you in considerable danger, regardless of what precautions we take. I would understand entirely if you wish to withdraw from this pursuit of your heritage, to step back from your position as my intended Luna, until this threat has been fully resolved. Elena met his gaze steadily, drawing strength from a place within herself that had carried her through every difficult moment since that first confrontation in the training yard months earlier. I will not withdraw, Damien. I have spent my entire life believing myself to be no one of significance, an orphan with no history, and no claim to anything beyond simple survival. I have finally learned the truth of my heritage, learned that I am the last surviving heir of a pack destroyed through betrayal, and I refuse to abandon that truth simply because pursuing it has proven dangerous. Something fierce and proud flickered across Damien's expression, mixed with genuine fear for her safety. Then we will face this danger together, and I will ensure you have every protection this palace can offer. Over the following days, Damien quietly increased security surrounding Elena's movements throughout the palace, assigning Ronan and several other trusted guards to remain near her at all times, though careful to avoid drawing excessive attention that might alert Lord Vale's allies to their growing suspicions. Meanwhile, Fitzgerald began carefully planning how they might retrieve Aldrich's hidden ledger from within Lord Vale's private estate, a task complicated significantly by the heightened security Lord Vale maintained around his household given the current political tensions. The ledger is kept within Aldrich's private study, Fitzgerald explained, during a careful planning session held in Damien's private chambers, joined by Ronan, Edmund, and Elena herself. Hidden behind a false panel within his writing desk, a detail I learned years ago, when Aldrich, in a moment of drunken carelessness, revealed its location, while boasting of his usefulness, to Lord Vale's ambitions. Retrieving it will require entering the estate without detection, Ronan observed, studying a rough sketch Fitzgerald had drawn of the estate's layout. Aldrich's study lies on the estate's second floor, accessible primarily through the main household corridors, which will certainly be guarded given the current circumstances. There is an alternative route, Fitzgerald said, pointing toward a section of the sketch depicting the estate's rear gardens. A servant's staircase leads directly to the second floor from these gardens, rarely used and infrequently guarded, given that most household staff prefer the more convenient main corridors for their daily duties. Edmund studied the plan carefully before speaking. This remains an enormous risk. Should any of you be discovered attempting to enter Lord Vale's estate without permission, the political consequences could prove severe, potentially strengthening his claims of impropriety surrounding this entire dispute, rather than weakening them. What alternative do we have? Damien asked, frustration evident in his voice. We cannot simply wait indefinitely, while Elena's safety remains threatened, and Lord Vale's campaign of doubt continues eroding council support for her legitimate claim. After considerable discussion, they finally settled on a plan. Ronan and Fitzgerald would attempt to retrieve the ledger under cover of darkness, using the servant's staircase Fitzgerald had identified, while Damien maintained his public presence at the palace, to avoid drawing suspicion, and Elena remained under careful guard within her own chambers, her absence from any suspicious activity, providing at least some measure of protection should their plan somehow be discovered. The night of the planned retrieval arrived with tense, uncertain anticipation hanging over the small group aware of what was about to unfold. Elena spent the evening unable to focus on her usual studies, her thoughts constantly drifting toward Ronan and Fitzgerald, wondering whether they had successfully entered Lord Vale's estate, wondering whether their plan would succeed, or whether it would instead confirm every fear currently threatening to overwhelm her fragile hope for justice. Near midnight, a soft knock sounded at her chamber door, and Elena opened it to find Damien standing in the hallway, his expression carrying the same tense uncertainty she herself had been struggling against throughout the long evening. I could not simply wait alone in my own chambers, he admitted, stepping inside once she gestured for him to enter. I find myself unable to concentrate on anything, beyond wondering whether Ronan and Fitzgerald have succeeded. I have felt the same way throughout this entire evening, Elena admitted, grateful for his company, despite the careful boundaries they had maintained throughout their courtship thus far. They sat together in comfortable, worried silence, the weight of uncertain danger drawing them closer despite the formal distance tradition demanded they maintain. Elena found herself leaning slightly against Damien's shoulder, and he did not pull away, instead offering quiet, steady comfort through simple proximity, as the long hours of waiting stretched onward. "Whatever happens tonight," Damien said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "I want you to know that my feelings for you have never once wavered, regardless of the political storm surrounding us, regardless of the dangerous truths we have uncovered about my own father's betrayal of your family. I chose you because of who you are, and nothing Lord Vale or Lady Seraphina attempts will ever change that choice." "I know," Elena said softly, genuine warmth spreading through her chest, despite the fear and uncertainty surrounding them. "And I want you to know that whatever happens, I do not regret placing my hand in yours that night, regardless of every challenge that decision has brought into my life since." They remained together until nearly dawn, when a soft, urgent knock finally sounded at the door. Elena opened it to find Ronan standing in the hallway, his expression exhausted but carrying an unmistakable spark of triumph, a worn leather-bound ledger clutched carefully in his hands. "We found it," he said simply, relief evident in every line of his weathered face. "Fitzgerald remains safely returned to his own chambers, and I believe, my lady, that what this ledger contains will prove more than sufficient to expose Lord Vale's deceptions, both the fabricated letter regarding Corwin's testimony, and, I fear, evidence of far more dangerous schemes he has orchestrated throughout the years to maintain and expand his family's influence." Elena took the ledger with trembling hands, understanding that whatever truths it contained would soon reshape the entire political landscape of the Northern Pack, exposing corruption that had likely remained hidden for far longer than the current dispute over her own legitimacy as Luna. But even as hope flickered brighter within her chest, Elena could not shake the lingering unease Fitzgerald's earlier warning had planted deep within her heart. The knowledge that Lady Seraphina had spoken of, measures more permanent than simple political discreditation, should doubt alone prove insufficient to remove her from her position. The ledger represented a crucial victory in the battle for her legitimate claim to Hartwell heritage, but Elena understood, with growing certainty, that the true danger facing her had only just begun, and that whatever desperate measures Lord Vale and his daughter might attempt next would likely prove far more dangerous than anything they had faced thus far. The morning after Ronan and Fitzgerald retrieved Aldrich's hidden ledger, Damien summoned the full council to an emergency session, determined to present the evidence before Lord Vale's allies could mount any further campaign of doubt against Elena's legitimate claim to the Hartwell heritage. Elena stood beside him, as the council chamber filled with noble representatives from across the Northern Pack's territories, many of them exchanging uncertain glances, sensing that whatever this unexpected gathering revealed would likely reshape the ongoing dispute that had consumed the palace for weeks. Lord Vale entered with his usual composed confidence, Lady Seraphina at his side, though Elena noticed a flicker of genuine unease cross both their expressions when they saw the worn leather ledger resting prominently on the table before Damien. "Your Majesty," Lord Vale said, his voice carrying practiced calm despite the tension visible in his posture. "What is the meaning of this unexpected session?" "I have called this council together," Damien said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority as Alpha King, "to address serious allegations regarding deliberate deception orchestrated against Elena Hart's legitimate claim to Hartwell heritage." Murmurs rippled through the assembled council members, and Elena watched carefully as Seraphina's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though she maintained her composed mask with practiced skill. "Deception, Your Majesty?" Lord Vale said, his tone carrying carefully measured surprise. "I am uncertain what you mean to suggest." "I mean to suggest," Damien said, opening the ledger and revealing pages filled with detailed records, "that the letter which recently cast doubt on Corwin's testimony regarding Elena's heritage was deliberately fabricated by a scribe in your employ, a man named Aldrich, whose services you have used repeatedly over the years to discredit rivals through carefully constructed deceptions." The council chamber fell into stunned silence as Damien methodically presented the ledger's contents, detailing specific instances recorded within its pages of documents Aldrich had fabricated on Lord Vale's behalf, including precise notation regarding the recent letter designed to undermine Corwin's credibility. "This is preposterous," Lord Vale said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier composure. "A ledger such as this, could easily have been fabricated itself, planted specifically to discredit my family's legitimate concerns regarding this maid's questionable claim to noble heritage. Perhaps, Edmund interjected calmly, having remained silent until this crucial moment, though I have already compared the handwriting within this ledger against several documents known to have been penned by Aldrich during his years of service within various noble households, including correspondence he has openly acknowledged authoring on your family's behalf regarding matters of trade and territory. The handwriting matches precisely. Lord Vale's composure finally cracked, his expression darkening with barely controlled fury as he realized the full weight of evidence now arrayed against him. Even if this ledger proves genuine, he said, his voice growing sharper, it proves nothing beyond a single fabricated letter. It does not prove Elena Hart's claim to Hartwell heritage carries any legitimate foundation whatsoever. You are correct, Damien acknowledged. This ledger alone does not prove Elena's heritage, but it does prove that your family has engaged in deliberate deception to discredit evidence supporting her claim, which raises serious questions about the legitimacy of every other objection your family has raised throughout this entire dispute. Before Lord Vale could formulate a response, the chamber doors opened, and Corwin entered, accompanied by an elderly woman Elena did not recognize, her weathered features carrying the particular dignity of someone who had traveled a considerable distance, despite advanced age. Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty, Corwin said, bowing respectfully. I have brought additional testimony that I believe will prove significant to this proceeding. The elderly woman stepped forward, her voice steady, despite visible nervousness at addressing such an important gathering. Your Majesty, my name is Beatrice. I served as a healer within the Hartwell Pack's territory 19 years ago, before its destruction. I attended Lady Marianne Hartwell during the birth of her daughter, and I have carried a birthmark description recorded in my personal healing journal ever since, a distinctive mark I observed upon the infant's shoulder at the time of her birth. Elena's breath caught, her hand instinctively rising to touch her own shoulder, where a small, crescent-shaped birthmark had rested for as long as she could remember, one she had never thought significant until this very moment. I would be willing, Beatrice continued, to examine Lady Elena's shoulder before this entire council, to confirm whether the birthmark matches my recorded description, evidence that alongside Corwin's testimony and the locket previously presented, should establish beyond reasonable doubt her legitimate identity as Lady Marianne Hartwell's surviving daughter. Damien looked toward Elena, silent question in his eyes, and she nodded firmly, understanding the significance of what was being offered. Within moments, Beatrice had confirmed before the entire assembled council that the crescent-shaped birthmark upon Elena's shoulder matched precisely the description recorded in her healing journal 19 years earlier, evidence so specific and personal that even Lord Vale's most loyal allies found themselves unable to formulate any reasonable objection. The council chamber erupted into a flurry of astonished conversation, and Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes as she absorbed the full weight of what had just occurred. After weeks of doubt, deception, and mounting danger, her legitimate claim to Hartwell heritage had finally been established beyond any reasonable dispute, confirmed through evidence that could not be dismissed as fabrication or coincidence. Lord Vale's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence entirely shattered by the mounting evidence arrayed against his objections. Beside him, Lady Seraphina's composed mask had finally slipped entirely, revealing raw fury barely contained beneath her carefully maintained beauty. This changes nothing regarding whether a Luna requires proper preparation for the responsibilities such a position demands, Lord Vale said, his voice growing desperate now, grasping for any remaining argument that might salvage his family's crumbling position. Heritage alone does not qualify someone to stand beside an Alpha King. Elena has spent the past weeks demonstrating precisely that qualification, Edmund said firmly. Her understanding of pack history, politics, and responsibility has grown remarkably in a short time, surpassing, I might add, several noble daughters who have spent their entire lives preparing for a role they may never actually assume. Damien raised a hand, silencing further debate as he addressed the full council with quiet, absolute authority. This matter is now settled. Elena Hart, rightful heir of the Hartwell Pack, has proven her legitimate claim to noble heritage beyond any reasonable doubt. Any further challenge to her position as my intended Luna will be considered a direct challenge to my authority as Alpha King, and will be addressed accordingly." The council chamber fell silent, understanding the finality in his words, and one by one, the noble representatives who had aligned themselves with Lord Vale's challenge began quietly withdrawing their support, recognizing that continued opposition now carried far greater political risk than acceptance. Lord Vale, recognizing his defeat, offered a stiff, formal bow before leading his daughter from the chamber, though Elena noticed the barely contained fury still simmering beneath Serafina's expression as she departed. A fury that suggested this defeat had done nothing to diminish whatever dangerous plans she and her father had discussed, regarding more permanent measures against Elena's continued survival. That evening, as celebration quietly began spreading through the palace, at news of Elena's formally recognized legitimacy, Damien found her alone in the palace gardens, seeking a rare moment of solitude to process the overwhelming events of the day. "You did it," he said softly, approaching her beneath the moonlit branches of an ancient oak tree that had stood within the palace grounds for generations. "We did it," Elena corrected gently, turning to face him. "I could not have accomplished any of this without your support, without Ronan and Fitzgerald's courage, without Corwin and Beatrice traveling such distances to offer their testimony on my behalf. You have earned the loyalty of remarkable people," Damien said, closing the distance between them. "That loyalty was not given freely simply because of your newly discovered heritage. It was earned through the character you demonstrated long before anyone knew you carried noble blood." Elena felt warmth spreading through her chest, a warmth that had little to do with the pleasant evening air surrounding them. "I still cannot quite believe everything that has happened since that morning in the training yard. My entire life has transformed in ways I never could have imagined." "And yet," Damien said quietly, reaching out to gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, "the woman standing before me now remains fundamentally the same person who refused to stand silent while someone was hurt, regardless of the personal risk involved. That courage, that unwavering character, has never once changed throughout everything we have faced together." They stood together beneath the ancient oak tree, the tension and danger of the preceding weeks momentarily forgotten in the quiet intimacy of the moment. Damien reached out, gently cupping Elena's face in his hands, and she felt her heart racing as he leaned closer. "Elena," he whispered, "may I kiss you?" "Yes," she breathed, and closed the remaining distance between them. The kiss they shared beneath the moonlit branches carried the weight of everything they had endured together. Every stolen conversation, every quiet moment of connection, every act of courage and loyalty that had brought them to this precise moment. When they finally parted, Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion the simple gesture had unlocked within her. "I have wanted to do that since the night of the ball," Damien admitted softly, his forehead resting gently against hers. "I have wanted the same thing for far longer than I dared to admit even to myself," Elena confessed. Their quiet moment of happiness, however, would prove short-lived. As they finally began walking back toward the palace, hand in hand, a sudden commotion erupted from the direction of the servants' quarters, shouts and cries of alarm cutting sharply through the peaceful evening silence. Damien's expression shifted immediately from tender warmth to sharp, protective alertness, and he pulled Elena instinctively behind him as guards came running toward them, their faces carrying grim urgency. "Your Majesty," one of the guards called out, breathless from running, "there has been an incident in the servants' quarters. A fire has broken out, and we believe it began near the chamber of a young kitchen maid named Grace." Elena's blood ran cold, terror gripping her chest, as she thought immediately of her closest friend within the palace. The same young woman whose defense in the training yard months earlier had begun this entire remarkable chain of events. "Is she safe?" Elena demanded, already moving toward the servants' quarters, despite Damien's attempt to keep her protectively behind him. "We do not yet know, my lady," the guard admitted grimly. "The fire spread quickly, and several servants remain unaccounted for." Elena broke into a run, Damien close behind her, both of them racing toward the servants' quarters where flames had already begun casting an ominous orange glow against the night sky, smoke billowing upward in dark, choking columns that carried with them a growing, terrible certainty that this fire had not begun by simple accident, but had instead been deliberately set, one final desperate measure orchestrated by enemies unwilling to accept their recent defeat within the council chamber. As Elena arrived at the scene of chaos and flame, servants rushing frantically to extinguish the growing fire, while others carried the injured and frightened away from the burning building, she felt a terrible certainty settle over her heart. Understanding that Lady Seraphina's earlier threat of more permanent measures had finally begun to manifest into terrible reality, and that Grace, her dearest friend within this palace, had somehow become an innocent target, caught within the crossfire of a political battle that had nothing whatsoever to do with her own life. The fire raged onward, and somewhere within the smoke and chaos, the true depths of Lady Seraphina and Lord Vale's desperation would soon reveal themselves in ways far more dangerous than anyone within the palace had yet anticipated. Elena pushed through the chaos surrounding the burning servants' quarters, her eyes streaming from smoke, her heart pounding with terror, as she searched desperately for any sign of Grace among the frightened faces illuminated by the growing flames. Servants rushed past her, carrying buckets of water, their efforts seeming impossibly small against the roaring fire, consuming an entire section of the building. "Grace!" Elena called out, her voice nearly lost amid the chaos and shouting surrounding her. "Grace, where are you?" Ronan appeared suddenly at her side, his face streaked with soot, his expression grim. "My lady, you should not be this close to the flames. Please, allow the guards to handle this situation." "Not until I know Grace is safe," Elena insisted, refusing to move despite the guards' clear concern for her safety. A commotion near the building's southern entrance drew their attention, and Elena watched with overwhelming relief as two servants emerged from the smoke, carrying between them a coughing, soot-covered figure, whose familiar features she recognized immediately. "Grace!" Elena cried, rushing forward as the servants gently lowered her friend onto the grass, a safe distance from the burning building. Grace's eyes fluttered open, disoriented and frightened, though relief flooded her expression as she recognized Elena kneeling beside her. "Elena!" she rasped, her voice rough from smoke inhalation. "I do not understand what happened. I was asleep, and then suddenly, my chamber was filled with smoke, and I could barely find my way to the door before the flames spread too far to escape safely." "You are safe now," Elena said, gripping her friend's hand tightly, tears of relief streaming down her face, despite the chaos surrounding them. "That is all that matters." As palace healers arrived to tend to Grace and several other servants who had suffered minor injuries during the chaotic evacuation, Damien approached, his expression carrying the particular grimness of someone who suspected far more than simple accident lay behind the fire's sudden, violent outbreak. "Ronan," he said quietly, drawing the guard aside while Elena remained close to Grace. "I want a thorough investigation into how this fire began. I do not believe for a moment that this was simple misfortune." "Nor do I, Your Majesty," Ronan agreed grimly. "The fire's origin point, according to servants who witnessed its earliest moments, appears to have begun near Grace's own chamber, spreading unusually quickly for what should have been a simple accidental blaze." Damien's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. "You believe this was a deliberate attempt to harm Grace specifically?" "I believe," Ronan said carefully, "that whoever orchestrated this fire may have intended to harm someone close to Elena, understanding the deep bond of friendship between them, perhaps hoping to send a clear message regarding the dangerous consequences of continued opposition to Lord Vale's ambitions, or perhaps hoping to cause Elena such devastating grief that she might withdraw from her position entirely." The following morning, as palace investigators examined the charred remains of the servants' quarters, evidence began emerging that confirmed everyone's worst suspicions. A guard discovered fragments of an unusual accelerant near the fire's point of origin, a substance not commonly found within the palace's ordinary stores, but one that Fitzgerald, upon examination, recognized immediately as identical to materials he had previously seen used within Lord Vale's estate, for specific, less than honorable purposes. Armed with this evidence, alongside growing suspicion regarding Lady Seraphina's earlier overheard threats, Damien summoned Lord Vale and his daughter to a private audience within his own study, this time accompanied only by Edmund and a small contingent of trusted guards, rather than the full council whose formal proceedings might allow the pair additional opportunity to construct careful denials. "You summoned us regarding the unfortunate fire in the servants' quarters," Lord Vale said upon arriving, his composed mask firmly in place, despite whatever concern he might have been genuinely feeling. "A terrible accident, Your Majesty. though I fail to understand why my daughter and I have been specifically summoned to discuss it. Because we have evidence suggesting this fire was no accident, Damien said, his voice carrying dangerous authority, as he gestured toward the fragments of accelerant recovered from the scene. Evidence matching materials known to be present within your estate, Lord Vale. Materials your household has used previously, for purposes I would very much like you to explain. Lord Vale's composure faltered slightly, though he quickly recovered. Your Majesty, surely you do not suggest my family bears responsibility for this terrible tragedy. Such materials are hardly unique to my estate alone. Perhaps not, Damien acknowledged, but combined with testimony overheard just days before this fire, testimony suggesting your daughter discussed pursuing more permanent measures against Elena's position, should political challenges alone prove insufficient, I find the timing of this incident far too convenient to dismiss as simple coincidence. Lady Seraphina's expression, which had remained carefully composed throughout her father's exchange with the king, finally cracked, fury and desperation breaking through her practiced beauty. You cannot possibly believe I would resort to such crude methods, Your Majesty. Burning down servants' quarters, potentially harming innocent people who have nothing whatsoever to do with this political dispute? Such an act would be beneath any noble family's dignity. And yet, Edmund interjected calmly, we have testimony that you specifically discussed such measures with your father. Testimony from a reliable witness who overheard your exact words regarding what steps might become necessary, should doubt alone prove insufficient to remove Elena from her position. Seraphina's face drained of color, and Elena, who had been standing quietly near the study's entrance, watching the confrontation unfold, saw genuine fear flicker across the noblewoman's expression, for the first time since this entire conflict had begun. I never intended for anyone to actually be harmed, Seraphina said finally, her voice growing smaller, less composed than Elena had ever witnessed. I only meant to frighten Elena, to send a warning that might convince her to withdraw from her position voluntarily, sparing everyone the political turmoil that has consumed this palace for weeks. I did not know Grace would be sleeping in that particular chamber that night. I believed it belonged to storage, not to a servant's living quarters. You are admitting to orchestrating this fire, Damien said, his voice deadly quiet. Seraphina's eyes widened as she realized the full weight of what her desperate confession had just revealed. I only meant to frighten your Majesty. I swear I never intended genuine harm. Enough, Lord Vale interrupted sharply, though his own expression had grown pale with the realization that his daughter's desperate confession had likely sealed both their fates. Seraphina, say nothing further. But the damage had already been done. Damien's expression had hardened into something Elena had never witnessed before. Cold fury, tempered by the absolute authority of his position as Alpha King. Lady Seraphina Vale, you have confessed before witnesses to deliberately setting fire to the palace's servants' quarters, an act that endangered numerous innocent lives, regardless of your claimed intentions. Such an act constitutes a serious crime against this pack, one that cannot go unpunished, regardless of your family's noble standing. Your Majesty, Lord Vale said, his voice now carrying genuine desperation, rather than his earlier practiced confidence. Surely we can discuss appropriate consequences privately, without involving the full council, or risking further damage to my family's standing within this territory. Your family's standing, Damien said coldly, should have been your primary concern before your daughter chose to endanger innocent lives in pursuit of political advantage. I will not shield either of you from the consequences of actions that could have easily resulted in innocent deaths. Elena, watching the confrontation unfold, felt a complex mixture of emotions swirling within her chest. Anger at the danger Seraphina's actions had posed to Grace, and countless other innocent servants. Relief that the truth had finally been exposed, confirming beyond any doubt the depths of desperation her enemies had been willing to pursue. And, surprisingly, a flicker of something almost like pity for Seraphina, who despite her cruelty and dangerous ambition, now stood before them looking genuinely frightened and, for the first time, entirely without the confident composure that had defined her throughout their entire acquaintance. May I speak? Elena asked quietly, stepping forward from where she had been observing the confrontation. Damien turned toward her, surprise flickering across his expression, though he gestured for her to continue. Lady Seraphina, Elena said, addressing the noblewoman directly for the first time since the confession had been revealed. You endangered the lives of people who had done nothing to deserve such treatment, simply because they lived within a building you targeted in pursuit of frightening me. That action deserves genuine consequence, and I will not pretend otherwise. Serafina's eyes met hers, wary and uncertain, clearly expecting further condemnation. But I also understand, Elena continued, what it feels like to watch something you believed rightfully belonged to you slip away, replaced by circumstances entirely beyond your control. I do not excuse what you did, but I recognize the desperation that likely drove you towards such dangerous measures. You would show me mercy, Serafina said slowly, disbelief evident in her voice. After everything I have done to harm you and those you care about? I would show you justice, tempered with the same mercy I hope others might show me, should I ever find myself equally desperate, and equally willing to abandon my own better judgment, Elena said carefully. Your Majesty, she continued, turning toward Damien, while I understand the necessity of formal consequence for what has occurred, I would ask that whatever punishment is determined might allow room for genuine remorse and eventual redemption, rather than permanent destruction of an entire family's standing and future. Damien studied Elena for a long moment, clearly weighing her request against the serious nature of the crime that had been committed. Finally, he nodded slowly. Your compassion does you credit, Elena, even toward those who sought to harm you. Lord Vale, Lady Serafina, formal consequences for this crime will be determined by the full council, as tradition and pack law require. However, I will ensure the council understands Elena's request for mercy, tempered with genuine accountability, rather than purely punitive destruction. Lord Vale, visibly shaken by the entire confrontation, bowed stiffly. Thank you, Your Majesty, and Lady Elena, for whatever measure of mercy you are willing to extend, despite our family's grievous actions against you. As Lord Vale and Serafina were escorted from the study by palace guards to await formal judgment from the council regarding appropriate consequences for their actions, Damien turned to Elena, admiration evident in his expression. You continue to surprise me, he said softly, once they were alone within the study. Even after everything Serafina attempted against you, against Grace, against your very safety, you still found room within your heart for compassion. I do not believe cruelty answered with equal cruelty ever truly resolves anything, Elena said quietly. Perhaps genuine consequence, combined with the opportunity for real change, might accomplish more than simple destruction ever could. That wisdom, Damien said, reaching out to gently take her hand, is precisely the quality that will make you an extraordinary Luna, Elena. Not simply strength or cleverness, but genuine wisdom tempered with compassion, even toward those who have wronged you most deeply. Over the following days, the full council convened to determine appropriate consequences for Lord Vale and Lady Serafina's actions. Ultimately, influenced by Elena's request for tempered mercy, the council determined that Lord Vale would be required to formally relinquish significant political influence within the Northern Pact's governing structure, while funding extensive repairs to the servants' quarters and providing compensation to every servant affected by the fire. Lady Serafina, meanwhile, would be required to serve an extended period of formal service directly within the palace's own household, working alongside the very servants she had endangered, a consequence designed specifically to teach genuine understanding and humility, rather than simple punishment alone. Grace, upon learning of this arrangement, expressed surprising acceptance. Perhaps working alongside those she wronged will teach her something valuable about the people she previously viewed as beneath her notice, she observed to Elena one afternoon, as they worked together, restoring order to the newly repaired servants' quarters. I hope so, Elena said honestly, though I understand if you struggle to feel similarly generous towards someone who nearly cost you your life. I will not pretend forgiveness comes easily, Grace admitted. But I trust your judgment, Elena. You have never once led either of us astray since that morning in the training yard, and I do not believe you would extend mercy to someone entirely undeserving of the chance to prove genuine change. As the political crisis surrounding Elena's legitimacy finally began settling into resolution, with her heritage formally recognized and her most dangerous enemies held accountable for their actions, the palace slowly returned to a calmer rhythm, though everyone within its walls understood that the true celebration still awaited them. The formal mating ceremony that would officially establish Elena Hart, once a simple maid, now the confirmed heir of the Hartwell pack, as Luna of the Northern pack, standing permanently beside King Damian Cross as his equal partner in leadership and love. The date for that ceremony had finally been set, and as preparations began throughout the palace, Elena found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From an orphaned maid with no knowledge of her own history, to the rightful heir of a destroyed pack, finally reclaiming not only her heritage, but a love and partnership she had never dared imagine possible for someone of her humble beginnings. The kingdom, having witnessed the full arc of this remarkable story, from mockery and disbelief to formal recognition and celebration, now prepared to witness its triumphant conclusion, as Elena Hart prepared to become, at last, the Luna the entire Northern pack would come to recognize, not simply for her newly discovered noble blood, but for the genuine strength, wisdom, and compassion that had defined her character from the very beginning. The morning of the mating ceremony arrived with clear skies stretching endlessly over the Northern pack's territory, a fitting backdrop for the celebration that had consumed the palace's every effort over the preceding weeks. Elena woke early, long before the sun had fully risen, unable to remain asleep given the enormity of what awaited her before the day concluded. Grace arrived shortly after dawn, accompanied by several palace attendants, carrying an exquisite gown that had been carefully crafted specifically for this momentous occasion, fashioned from deep blue silk, embroidered with silver thread that caught the morning light like captured starlight. A design chosen deliberately to honor the colors traditionally associated with the Hartwell pack, ensuring Elena would enter this ceremony not simply as an outsider claiming a new position, but as the rightful heir reclaiming her heritage before the eyes of the entire kingdom. "You look radiant," Grace whispered, once the attendants had finished helping Elena into the magnificent gown, stepping back to admire the transformation with tears gathering in her eyes. "I still remember the frightened maid who once helped me fold linens in this very palace, never imagining she would one day become our Luna." "I could never have imagined it either," Elena admitted, studying her own reflection in the tall mirror before her, still struggling to fully reconcile the elegant woman staring back at her with the simple maid she had been only months earlier. "None of this would have happened without your friendship, Grace. That morning in the training yard changed everything, though I never could have predicted where it would eventually lead us." "Perhaps that is precisely why it happened," Grace said softly. "Sometimes the smallest moments of courage set into motion changes far greater than we could ever anticipate." As the appointed hour approached, Elena made her way toward the palace's grand courtyard, where the entire kingdom had gathered to witness the formal ceremony that would establish her permanently as Luna of the Northern pack. Noble families from every territory had traveled considerable distances to attend, alongside countless servants and common folk who had been granted special permission to witness the historic occasion from designated areas surrounding the courtyard's edges. Elena felt her heart racing as she walked through the gathered crowd, flanked by Livia and Edmund, both of whom had become genuine sources of support and guidance throughout the tumultuous weeks leading toward this moment. She caught glimpses of familiar faces among the crowd, Ronan standing proudly near the ceremonial platform, Fitzgerald watching with quiet satisfaction, Corwin and Beatrice, who had traveled back from their distant villages, specifically to witness the ceremony their testimony had helped make possible. She also noticed, near the edge of the gathered nobility, Lord Vale and Lady Seraphina, both dressed in formal but understated attire, befitting their diminished political standing. Watching the proceedings with expressions Elena found genuinely difficult to interpret, though she thought she detected something that might have been sincere respect beneath Seraphina's carefully composed features, a marked contrast from the barely contained fury that had once defined every interaction between them. At the center of the courtyard, standing upon a raised platform decorated with flowers representing both the Northern pack and the restored Hartwell heritage, Damian waited, dressed in formal ceremonial attire that made him appear every bit the powerful Alpha King the entire kingdom recognized him to be, though Elena noticed the warmth in his expression the moment their eyes met across the crowded courtyard, warmth that had nothing to do with formal duty and everything to do with genuine love. As Elena ascended the platform to stand beside him, the assembled crowd fell into respectful silence, and an elderly pack elder, tasked with overseeing the formal ceremony, stepped forward to address the gathered kingdom. "We gather today," the elder began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard, "to witness a union unlike any this kingdom has previously known. A union between our Alpha King, Damian Cross, and Elena Hart, confirmed heir of the Hartwell pack, whose journey from humble service within this very palace to rightful recognition of her noble heritage stands as testament to the truth that genuine strength of character matters more than circumstance of birth. The elder continued, reciting the traditional words and rituals that had bound generations of Alpha Kings and their chosen Lunas throughout the Northern Pack's long history, words Elena had spent considerable time memorizing during her weeks of preparation, though speaking them aloud, before the entire assembled kingdom, carried a weight and significance that mere memorization could never have fully prepared her to experience. When the moment finally arrived for Damian to formally declare her as his Luna before the complete assembly, he turned to face her directly, taking both her hands in his dark eyes carrying an intensity and warmth that made the surrounding crowd, the elaborate ceremony, even the weight of the entire kingdom's attention, seemed to fade into distant unimportance. "Elena Hart," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident beneath his formal composure. "From the moment I witnessed your courage in defending someone who could not defend themselves, I knew I had found someone extraordinary. Through every challenge we have faced together since that day, your strength, your wisdom, and your compassion have only continued proving what I recognized in you from the very beginning. Before this entire kingdom, I declare you my Luna, my equal partner in leadership, and the keeper of my heart, for as long as we both shall live." Elena felt tears streaming freely down her face as she responded with the traditional words expected of her, though she found herself adding, spontaneously, words that had not been part of the ceremony's careful script. "Damian Cross, you saw something worthy in me long before I recognized it in myself. You chose honesty over convenience, character over calculation, and love over the political expectations everyone believed you should follow instead. I accept this bond not simply as Luna of the Northern Pack, but as your equal partner in everything the future holds for us, and I promise to honor that partnership with everything I am." As the pack elder pronounced their union formally complete, the entire courtyard erupted into thunderous celebration, cheers and applause rising from noble and common folk alike, a unified expression of joy that Elena had never dared imagine possible during the difficult, uncertain weeks that had preceded this triumphant moment. Damian pulled her close, and their kiss, shared openly, before the entire kingdom this time, rather than hidden beneath moonlit branches, sealed a bond that had been built through genuine trials of character, courage, and unwavering love. The celebration that followed stretched throughout the remainder of the day and well into the evening, the palace grounds transformed into a joyous gathering, unlike anything Elena had witnessed during her years as a simple maid within these same walls. She danced with Damian beneath strings of lantern light, laughed with Grace and Ronan among the celebrating crowds, and shared quiet, meaningful conversation with Livia, who embraced her warmly, as a genuine daughter, rather than simply a political necessity. Near the celebration's conclusion, as the festivities began winding down and exhausted but joyful guests slowly began retiring for the evening, Elena found herself approached by Lady Serafina, who had remained at the celebration's edges throughout most of the evening, watching the proceedings with quiet, thoughtful reflection. "Congratulations," Serafina said, her voice carrying genuine sincerity that Elena had never previously heard from her. "I know those words likely mean little coming from someone who caused you and your friends such genuine harm, but I wanted to offer them regardless." "Thank you, Serafina," Elena said, genuinely touched by the apparent sincerity behind the simple gesture. "How has your service within the palace household been progressing?" "Humbling," Serafina admitted, a small, rueful smile touching her lips. "I have spent weeks working alongside servants I once dismissed as beneath my notice, and I have learned more about genuine strength and dignity from them than I ever learned throughout my entire privileged upbringing. Grace, in particular, has shown me remarkable grace, despite everything my actions cost her." "She possesses a generous heart," Elena said warmly. "I am glad you have found something meaningful within this period of consequence." "I do not expect friendship between us," Serafina said carefully, "given everything that has occurred. But I wanted you to know that I recognize now, truly recognize, that Damian's choice of you as Luna was never a mistake born of foolish infatuation, as I once believed. You possess qualities of leadership and character that I spent my entire life failing to develop, focused instead on status and ambition rather than genuine substance. Elena considered her words carefully before responding. Perhaps friendship need not be entirely out of reach, Serafina, should you continue on this path of genuine growth and reflection. This kingdom benefits far more from unity and mutual respect than from lingering rivalry and resentment. Serafina's eyes widened slightly, clearly not having expected such an open offer of potential reconciliation. That is more generous than I likely deserve, but I would welcome the opportunity to prove myself worthy of such consideration, in time. As Serafina departed to rejoin her father among the remaining guests, Damien appeared at Elena's side, having witnessed the exchange from a respectful distance. "You continue to demonstrate remarkable wisdom," he said softly, wrapping an arm gently around her waist. "Even our former enemies find themselves transformed by your example." "Perhaps that is the truest measure of what it means to lead well," Elena said thoughtfully, leaning into his embrace as they watched the last of the celebration's lantern lights flickering against the darkening sky. "Not simply defeating those who oppose us, but creating space for genuine transformation and growth, even among those who once sought to cause us harm." As the night deepened and the palace grounds slowly emptied of celebrating guests, Elena and Damien remained together beneath the stars, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had led them to this moment, from a chance encounter in a training yard to a formal union, recognized and celebrated by an entire kingdom. "Do you regret any part of this journey?" Damien asked quietly, as they walked together through the quiet palace gardens, the same gardens where he had first asked to kiss her weeks earlier. "I regret the danger our journey brought to those we love," Elena admitted honestly. "The fire that endangered Grace, the deception and betrayal we uncovered along the way, but I do not regret a single moment of choosing honesty over silence, courage over comfortable safety, or love over the careful boundaries everyone believed should have separated us permanently." "Nor do I," Damien said softly, pulling her close beneath the star-filled sky. "You transformed not only my own life, Elena, but this entire kingdom's understanding of what genuine strength and worthiness truly means. Lineage matters less than character. Status matters less than genuine kindness. And love, real love, built on honesty and mutual respect, matters more than any political calculation this court ever believed necessary." As they stood together beneath the same ancient oak tree that had witnessed their first kiss weeks earlier, Elena reflected on how far she had traveled since that frightened morning in the training yard, when she had simply refused to stand silent while someone she cared about suffered unnecessary cruelty. That single act of courage, born not from calculation or ambition, but from genuine conviction, had set into motion a journey that transformed not only her own understanding of herself, but the entire kingdom's understanding of what true leadership and partnership could mean. She was no longer simply Elena Hart, the maid once mocked and dismissed by an entire court, certain she could never belong among their elevated circles. She was Elena Hart, Luna of the Northern Pack, rightful heir of the Hartwell heritage, and equal partner to an alpha king who had recognized her worth long before the rest of the kingdom learned to see it themselves. And as she looked up into Damien's eyes, filled with the same warmth and certainty that had first drawn her toward him during that quiet conversation after the very first ball, Elena understood that whatever challenges the future might still hold for their kingdom and their partnership, they would face them together, bound not simply by formal ceremony or political necessity, but by a genuine love that had proven itself worthy through every test of character, courage, and unwavering devotion that their extraordinary journey had demanded of them both. The kingdom that had once mocked a simple maid dancing with its alpha king now celebrated her as their rightful Luna, and the story of Elena Hart, from overlooked servant to beloved queen, would be remembered throughout the Northern Pack's history as proof that true worthiness has never depended on the circumstances of one's birth, but on the unwavering strength, honesty, and compassion carried within one's own heart, waiting patiently for the moment the entire world would finally recognize what truly mattered all along.